You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Justin Quick, and this is episode 49. Almost at the big 5-0, guys, already. Before I introduce tonight's very special guest, I just want to let everybody know that Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, is the official sponsor of the Holy Smokes podcast. Family-owned and operated, great service, fine cigars. They take great care of myself, my family, and my friends. So if you guys would be so kind as to just go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like, I would much appreciate that. Right now, I'm smoking a WD Robusto, a nice budget cigar, around $5 Canadian, and it lasts me about an hour and a half. So perfect for tonight. And I'm pairing that with some J&B whiskey. So I have with me, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Larry Chapp. Before I bring him on, I'm just going to read his short biography that he provided to me. Dr. Larry Chapp is a retired professor of theology. He got his doctorate in 1994 at Fordham University with a specialization on the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar. He is now the owner and manager of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm near Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. Larry, welcome to the show. How are you doing? I see that, like me, you've got your beverage and your cigar queued up, so that's very cool.
Yes, it's great to be here. I'm smoking a Hoya de Monterey and drinking a little cheap Evan Williams bourbon.
Cheers to you, my friend. Thank you. This is
Cheers,
awesome.
Yes, yeah.
Very excited.
This is the first podcast I've done with cigars and bourbon, so kudos to you.
Yes, sir. Somebody had to do it, right? So
that's right.
All right. So before we jump into the topic for tonight, which is the errors and dangers of radical reactionary traditionalism, why don't you tell us just a bit about yourself, your spiritual background, how your faith life was like growing up, and what kind of endeavors you're involved in now, including the Dorothy Day Worker Farm, which I haven't heard about before. So I'd really like to know what this is.
Sure. Okay. I'll make this very short and sweet. I'm a Midwestern boy. Originally, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. That's my hometown. That's where I grew up. Went to high school and all my schooling there. I am the son of blue-collar parents. My father was a fire chief in Lincoln, a district chief, and so that sort of blue-collar Midwestern background really is who I am. Someone once said that, Chapp, you have a blue-collar heart and a white-collar head, and that's kind of true. I sort of was rather weird as a young man, just being sort of a bookish nerd, intellectual, egghead kind of a kid who was always interested in big ideas and academic, intellectual things. And so I eventually went to seminary for a while. I didn't make it to priesthood, but I was in seminary, and then I got my doctorate at Fordham because I knew that I wanted to teach theology and pursue theological discourse, which I did for 20 years at DeSales University, which is near Allentown, Pennsylvania. I taught undergraduates exclusively because DeSales does not have a master's program in theology. And I absolutely loved teaching undergraduates. I think I was pretty good at it, and it's an age group that I really excelled at teaching. And but then after 20 years, I wanted to change. And so my wife and I, along with a former student of ours who is now a priest monk at the Abbey of the Genesee, Father John Gribowich, we decided to start a Catholic worker farm, which is northwest of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is northeastern PA. And what if you just quickly, it's based on the teachings of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, who started the Catholic worker movement in the 1930s. There's a lot of misunderstandings about them. People think they're communists. They're not. They're not. Dorothy and Peter were both extremely devout and Orthodox Catholics. The reputation that they get, I think, is because the Catholic worker movement in general has gotten a little squirrely in some quarters. Not all, some. But that's being fixed right now as we speak. But part of the Catholic worker movement was, of course, soup kitchens in the cities, but they also had this agrarian vision of starting these Catholic worker farms that would grow food for soup kitchens and food pantries, that sort of thing, but also acted as little places where people could come and get away from it all, to recharge. Right. And Dorothy Day was a Benedictine oblate, and we are too. And we have a small... We have a small chapel on our campus, on our farm, and we do the Liturgy of the Hours there. And when people come to visit, we do what Peter Morn called roundtable discussions, where we will sit and discuss big ideas and then share prayer and so on.
That's beautiful.
Our main focus is sheep, actually. My part of the vision of the Catholic Worker Farm is to reintroduce. It's kind of a back to the land movement before its time to reintroduce artisanal skills. And one of the things we do is my wife processes the wool of our sheep, and she teaches people how to process wool, spin wool into yarn, and so on. And that's a big part of what we do. So anyway, and then I started my blog about a year and a half ago, just as it was just a lark. I mean, people would come to the farm and we'd sit around and BS and talk big ideas over booze. And and they would say, God, Chapp, you need to start a blog. You've got some ideas people need to hear. Nobody needs to hear me. And the last thing in the world needs is another stupid blog. But I started it. It's called GaudiumEtSpes22.com. It's 22 is a section in the conciliar Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, Church in the Modern World, that contains, in my mind, the heart and soul of the entire council. There's a quote in there that John Paul II quoted in almost every single one of his encyclicals and thought it was the hermeneutical key to the whole council. In essence, what Gaudium et Spes 22 says is that you cannot understand human beings until you understand Christ.
Right.
That it is only in the light of the incarnation that the full mystery of human nature becomes clear as to who we truly are. Right. And so that's why I named the blog Gaudium et Spes 22, not only to highlight that fact to the council, but also to, in many ways, defend the Second Vatican Council against many of its detractors. The council has its flaws. I'm working on a blog post right now that is very, very critical, actually, of big parts of Gaudium et Spes, but ends by retrieving it through section 22. So I have no problem with people criticizing this. Any council can be criticized.
Sure.
It is the wholesale rejection of the council that is now in vogue that I have issues with. But anyway, we're getting into our conversation now. But that's who I am, and that's why I'm here. The blog actually took off. It sort of went viral, and I was the biggest, most surprised person of all that happened. I mean, I ended up just last month going on Robert Barron's show, Bishop Barron.
Right.
Because of the blog, and I now I'm writing books for Word on Fire because of the blog, and Ignatius Press because of the blog, and now I'm doing a podcast with you because of the blog and a few other people. So I just shake my head and go, who the hell wants to listen to me? But apparently a few people do, so I'm happy about that.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to have you on, Larry, and I could kind of relate to your feeling. I mean, people always told me you should start a blog, you should write a book. Ultimately, the only reason I started a podcast was because my wife kept harassing me, and God bless her. I put it off for the longest time, But
my wife too.
God bless them, the feminine genius, right? So,
although my wife gave me some great advice, which is, she said, don't be like these bloggers that feel like they have to pump something out every day, where they have an opinion on everything. Only write when you have something to say.
Yeah.
And so that's why people who follow my blog know that I only blog like once every 10 days, 2 weeks. I'm not like Rod Dreher where something comes out every day. I just blog every couple weeks because it takes a while to write these things. I haven't written lately because I had COVID, but I'm
Oh, no.
Yeah, but my wife did too. And in our case, it was very mild, and we're over it.
Oh, thanks be to God. Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that.
I still can't taste anything, though.
That what a weird side effect that is.
Oh, jeez.
Like, come on, really?
Yeah, crazy.
So I first encountered you actually was through my friend Michael Lofton's show, Reason and Theology.
I like Mike.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and I love what he's doing. And I love what the subject of what you guys were talking about. When I tuned in, you were talking a bit about the motu proprio, and you went into Vatican II and stuff.
Yeah.
But that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So this pontificate, I don't know, it's been 8 years already.
I think 8.
8 years, and for many people, it's been quite a long 8 years.
Yeah.
and it's led some very good souls to say things like the church is basically, without saying it, the church is defectible, the church has gone into apostasy, and all the rest of it. Things that during Benedict or JP2's reign, they would have never escaped their mouths, but unfortunately here we are. So I wanted to talk about some of these issues. Yourself, growing up a Catholic, or just in relatively recent times, were you ever identified with the traditionalist movement in any sense, or no?
Well, you have to understand, when I was growing up, and I'm 62, almost 63 years old. I mean, I grew up in the silly season of post-Vatican II Catholicism, and there were traditionalists around, but most of them were not the kinds of traditionalists that you see today. The radical traditionalists of that time, all followed Archbishop Lefebvre. They were St. Pius X, Society of St. Pius X types, and they were very marginal and very fringe. And the biggest battle was between very liberal Catholics, who had the upper hand immediately after the council, and then conservative Catholics, who simply wanted to abide by papal teaching, traditional teaching. But you really didn't have the kind of radical traditionalism, other than the Lefebvrites, that you have today, which is really energized now across the board.
Right.
And so I was a conservative Catholic. I was a sort of Paul VI and then John Paul II Catholic as I was growing up. I never understood why Paul VI seemed to allow so much craziness in the church, but I respected the fact, things like Humanae Vitae and so on, that he was Orthodox and Rome was holding, the center was holding. So I was a fan of Paul VI. I felt sorry for him. I thought he was a martyr in the face of many things. And then John Paul came. And John Paul remains to this day the hero of my life, the theological, spiritual hero. I know he's not perfect. He was tone deaf to the sex abuse crisis, and he did a few squirrely things here and there. But man, I want your viewers to understand, if they're young, to imagine what it was like in 1978 when John Paul was elected, and he was, 58 or 59 when he was elected. I cannot communicate strongly enough how absolutely electrifying the first decade or so of his papacy actually was. The man was just so charismatic and so powerful that he inspired an entire generation of young Catholics like myself, and therefore we didn't drift off into hyper-traditionalism. We were totally content to remain faithful to John Paul II Catholicism. And then with Pope Benedict, the trouble is that there's perception out there that Pope Francis is a liberal. And so now a lot of conservative Catholics who were fine with Vatican II and the Novus Ordo and all that, so long as John Paul and Benedict were Pope, now they have this perception, well, not even the center is holding anymore. Not even Rome is. So they've been red-pilled, as they like to say, by Pope Francis.
Yes.
And their eyes have been opened and realize, I was an ultramontanist before. I was an ultra-papalist before. But now I see popes can be horrible. They can be heretical. And I need to dial it back and realize that I need to hang my hat on pre-Vatican II tradition and not on the post-Vatican II papacies. And so it is, unfortunately, the papacy of Pope Francis that has energized this movement.
Yeah, and everything happens for a reason. So I'm sure with hindsight in some years, we might be able to look back and say, aha, this is why the Lord permitted this papacy. I mean, I know there's a lot of bad taking place in the church, but one of God's calling cards is he brings good out of apparent evil, right? So it's hard to see right now because we're in the thick of things. But you brought up a very good point, Larry, and it's something that actually grinds my gears a little bit. Is again, you have this sort of narrative where Pope Benedict and St. John Paul the Great were Orthodox.
Yeah.
And Pope Francis is the black sheep. He's the radical outlier. He's the either, material or formal heretic or just a danger to the church, one of the three.
Yeah.
A certain commentator has actually, who's a traditionalist, a radical reactionary traditionalist, let me clarify. He actually said something very erudite. He said, Benedict, John Paul, and Francis are all the same. That consistency is actually true. It just depends, what do we make of it? Is it a bad or a good thing? Because for example, all the times that Pope Benedict has spoken or written about the Francis pontificate, he's always pledged his fidelity.
Oh, yeah.
He always says they're in continuity with each other. So it's almost like, well, do we do the logical thing and just take his words at face value? Or do we then drift off into conspiracy mode by saying, oh, he didn't really mean that, or he was pressured to say this, or he was just playing nice, but he doesn't really believe that?
Well, the thing is, we have to take him at face value. What else can we do?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you're in some kind of a game where you're guessing at his true motives, what he really thinks. And if your conclusion then is he really thinks Pope Francis is a heretic, well, then you're going to have to accuse Pope Benedict of lying.
Yeah.
You have to say he's a liar. At the very least, if Pope Benedict thought Francis was a heretic, at the very least, Pope Benedict would just remain silent. He wouldn't say anything.
That's right.
Because it would be unseemly for this novelty called a retired pope to sit on the fringes, sitting there in the Vatican, throwing pot shots at Pope Francis and saying, hey, you can't say that, that's heresy. Oh, for crying out loud, Benedict is smart enough to know you cannot do that. And so the other alternative, if he really thought the Pope is a heretic, would just be to remain silent. But he hasn't remained silent. Like you said, and on about 5 or 6 occasions, he has come out and said, I support Pope Francis.
Correct.
Let me be clear about something. I'm not exactly a huge Pope Francis fan.
Right.
I don't think he has the intellectual talent of a Benedict or the charisma of a John Paul. None of those things. But and so he doesn't move my needle the way John Paul and Benedict did, ecclesiastically, theologically.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to stand up here and blow smoke, literally, and say, oh, yeah, I love Pope Francis. That's simply not true. On the other hand, I'm going to defend him because he is the Pope, duly elected Pope. The previous Pope was retired, has voiced his support for him, and how could I do any less? Yes. And I do not think that the charges from the ultra-right that Pope Francis is a heretic are true. I think that is an extremely dangerous thing to say about a sitting pope. It must de facto commit you to claiming that Francis is in fact an anti-pope. Because if a pope is teaching formal heresy, which is what some charge, and they're out there, if the pope is teaching formal heresy, then that makes him, and deliberately so, that makes him an anti-pope, does it not? Are you not, therefore, by definition, in something of a schism, whether you want to admit it or not? Mm-hmm. And notice something here. The people that say these things on social media, that Francis is a formal heretic, are the same people who are pushing the latest craziness of Archbishop Vigano, who says that Francis is the head of a false church, a false parallel church. Wait a minute. That doesn't make any ecclesiological sense on a theological level. What do you mean a false parallel church to the true church? We're remnant Catholics adhering to the true church versus the false church of this heretical pope sort of thinking. That's schismatic. I don't care what you want to call it. Theologically, you are in schism. And that is extremely dangerous and extremely unfortunate. We've had a lot of bad popes in the history of the church, and Francis doesn't even come close to being the worst.
Thank you for saying that. It's interesting, this whole conspiratorial tone, we are the remnant. Basically, the beast is in the Vatican in so many or so few words. That's kind of what it measures out to be. Now, when I was a fundamentalist evangelical, this kind of stuff was par for the course.
Oh, yeah.
Our little sect, we have the true understanding of Scripture. We are the elect. These guys over there in Rome especially, but even these guys over here down the street, They ain't got it. And it's funny, when I became Catholic, I thought that I had escaped this type of mentality, but lo and behold, here it is.
It's there, and I recognize it too, because even though I'm a cradle Catholic, when I was in high school, I went through a bit of a rebellious phase where I sort of became, while I was still a Catholic, I sort of became one of these born-again evangelical Christians of a dispensationalist end times variety. I was reading Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth and things like that, and so, yeah, for there was like a 3 or 4 year span where I was all into that stuff too. The Pope is the whore of Babylon, he's the Antichrist and all this. So that was stock in trade rhetoric for those kinds of anti-Catholic dispensationalists. And now, how shocking is it that you suddenly see modern Catholic ultra-traditionalists spouting the same nonsense? They read like a Jack Chick tract,
I was just going to say that exact thing. It's almost like Vigano's latest letter or headline. They're like the new Jack Chick tracts for Catholics. Yeah. They really are.
And yeah, for people that don't know who Jack Chick is, he died like 10 years ago. He was an ultra nut job, fundamentalist Protestant evangel. I don't even know how you'd he came up with all these like comic book cartoon things that, put forward the Jesuits are running the world BS, and the Pope has a computer with every Protestant name in it, and that Catholics are going to go to hell because we worship a cookie.
A cookie, yeah, the death cookie, right?
Oh, the death cookie. That's right.
What it was called. Yeah.
Cookie.
Now go ahead. Sorry, I was just going to say I'm sure that he's got a degree of invincible ignorance and lessened culpability, right? But Catholics, we should know better.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what Jack Chick's background was, or Hal Lindsey, or any of those guys. But one thing I know is some of these guys are all about money, which is why some of these evangelical types who are end-timers have softened their anti-Catholicism because they have a lot of Catholic followers.
Yeah.
And they make a lot of scratch off Catholics. I know Pat Robertson of the 700 Club really toned down his anti-Catholic rhetoric because he suddenly realized he was getting some scratch from Catholics. So there's a lot of cynicism you can throw in there. But yeah, these Catholic traditionalists should know better. Then what they do is there is a quasi-church teaching out there that says that the church is going to have to recapitulate the life of Christ. And so the church herself is ultimately going to go through a kind of crucifixion. And some saints have spoken about how towards the end of time, before the second coming, the church will fall into a great apostasy. And that quite frankly, it could even touch Rome itself. And so what you find Vigano is talking about the great apostasy. And you find those, I don't want to name names, but those on the internet who spout Vigano's stuff also talk about the great apostasy. So what their claim is sort of that we are in the end times, and that Pope Francis is probably an anti-pope, and he is the pope of the great apostasy. Mm-hmm. Except there's no evidence for that.
Right.
And what they're doing is they're taking their red-pilled anger at a pope who's a little more liberal than his predecessors and turning it into an entire ecclesiological ideology. Because I'm going to mention one name, and it's a guy, Steve Skojec. You know Steve.
Yeah.
Who started the blog 1 Peter 5.
1 Peter 5, yeah.
I like Steve Skojec. He's one of the few traditionalists who has a soul, who actually has a conscience and has an intellect. And Steve Skojec refuses to engage in this kind of stuff, which is why I think he's kind of backed away from 1 Peter 5, as a Substack.
Yeah.
And, he's come right out and said, I've been sort of red-pilled by Pope Francis, but I'm not going to go on to all of this nonsense of Vigano. I'm not going to do the false church kind of stuff. I have to simply sit back and I've got to retool and rethink all of this stuff.
God bless him.
And God bless Steve for his honesty, his brutal honesty, which is why I love the guy. But some of these others have decided, no, I'm going to double down on infallibility and indefectibility. I'm going to maintain that, but I'm going to maintain that none of that pertains to the modern church. In other words, if you want to adhere to two things, Pope Francis and the entire post-Vatican II Church is heretical, and you want to hang on to infallibility, indefectibility, you are, by a strict logic, required, therefore, to adhere to some kind of soft sede vacantism, right? That the church has simply ceased. The official church has gone off the rails, and the real church is somehow some sort of subterranean remnant church. And that's where the infallibility and indefectibility still resides.
Yeah. So why do you suppose? So what's the outrage at Pope Francis? Like what's the kind of are there any watershed moments that caused increasing amounts of angst and anger? From what I remember, the big elephant in the room, the first thing to really hit the fan was Amoris Laetitia and the Dubia. That was the big thing.
It. Mm-hmm.
So for me, like just speaking for myself, I don't see. I mean, we can question the prudence of a disciplinary move, a teaching or whatever, but on it, for substantially speaking, there's no heresy here. I mean, it's Catholicism 101 that if you have mitigating factors and you have grave matter, then you don't always have the ingredients for a mortal sin. And it's up to the priest or confessor in the internal forum to lay that out. And
right.
You obey your confessor. You obey your confessor in everything except if they're asking you to commit manifest evil. But some have said, if a priest gives you the green light to receive communion in it, after having committed certain acts, even if he's determined there's mitigating factors, you're still actively or positively committing a sin, and therefore Pope Francis has encouraged the commission of evil and calling evil good and good evil. That's the kind of thing that I've heard.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, this issue of divorce and remarriage. I mean, full disclosure, I'm divorced and remarried with the benefit of a church annulment.
Right.
And so I've been through the process. Now, the deal is this. First off, everybody focuses on that famous footnote. What was it, 251, 351, whatever it is?
351, yeah,
351,
exactly. Mm-hmm.
Right, where he says, in a little tiny footnote, I'm giving pastors a certain discretion on the ground in the internal forum to sort of adjudicate these things. Well, fine. But then people ignore the rest of Amoris Laetitia, which is a stunningly beautiful document.
It really is.
It's a bit verbose. Pope Francis is he's pretty pretty verbose. And there's some redundancies in there and some unnecessary sidebar conversations about this, that, and the other thing. But it's actually a truly orthodox and beautiful document on marriage, and I wish people would read it. Okay, but let's focus on this one thing. First off, he's only sort of acknowledging a practice that already happens.
Yes.
Everybody knows, that there are priests out there who have a strong pastoral soul, who know their parishioners well, who, after lengthy conversations with sort of a divorced and remarried couple, for whom an annulment is impossible because witnesses are gone, and there are cases where an annulment just you're not going to be able to prove it. Let's put it that way, and the pastor knows that. But in getting to know this couple, the pastor realizes, you know what? I'm firmly convinced that her first marriage was invalid.
Yes.
I'm convinced of that. I know her family well and what they tell me and so on. And so that we all know. That priest then says to her, look, Sheila, whoever, Karen, right?
Karen gets a bad rap these days.
If you present yourself for communion, I will not deny you. And I think that footnote 351 is in some ways the Pope's acknowledgement that this is in fact a pastoral reality, and it isn't necessarily a bad pastoral reality. What it is in effect are pastors granting a kind of quasi annulment
Exactly.
on their authority. And that's how I read that footnote, that the Pope is granting people, priests, pastors, in difficult circumstances
Hmm.
to sort of grant people a kind of annulment, not an official one, but a sort of annulment based on his knowledge of them. And I think that is a beautiful gesture on the Pope's part, actually. Even Pope Benedict, when he was first elected Pope, said, I can't remember it now, he said something to the effect that this issue of divorce and remarriage and annulments and stuff is an issue that the church has to look at. Even Pope Benedict understood this is a tremendous pastoral problem within the church, that the annulment process has deep flaws within it. Part of, and the other thing that people need to understand is not everywhere in the world is it possible for people to access an annulment process.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're spoiled in the United States. Every diocese has a marriage tribunal staffed by, all kinds of professionals and so on. Same with Europe and more sophisticated, advanced countries. But there are vast, vast swaths of the church in the third world and so on where this is just not possible.
It's not possible. Yeah.
And so there has to be some way for pastors on the ground to deal with the fact that marriages sometimes fail because they weren't marriages in the first place, not in a full sacramental sense.
Yes.
And so that's how, I wish the Pope hadn't done it in a footnote. I have my own criticisms of that. I wish that he had elaborated more along the lines of what you and I are talking about now, and he didn't. Nevertheless, to accuse him of heresy because of that one footnote, I think betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the complexities of the issues that Pope Francis would do. And quite frankly, has it really changed church practice that much? There are still marriage tribunals. People are still required to go through the annulment process. I know several people right now, friends of mine, who are in the annulment process and waiting for their annulments. Okay, so it's not as if that single footnote has suddenly now scuttled the entire disciplinary apparatus of the church.
Yes. Thank you, Larry, for saying that, because you bring up two very important points. So when I was first exposed to this footnote and the commentary surrounding it, it kind of gave me the impression that the Pope was saying, okay, even though the first marriage was valid, you can still go ahead and receive communion in the second union, but your culpability is lessened. But that's not what it's saying.
No.
Like I was talking to Dr. Robert Fastigi a couple of years ago in February.
I love him. He's great.
He's great. We met at a cigar bar. He was so gracious. He met me and my men's group there. But he talked to me about this, and he said, "Look, first of all, it's like you said. He's not saying let's bypass the ordinary means of a marriage tribunal, the external forum.
Right.
He's not saying that. He's saying in certain cases, like you say, a formal marriage tribunal is simply not accessible. So should these people, through no fault of their own, not have access to the same kind of forum that other people have? Well,
Right.
The internal then takes the place of an external. So it's not, hey, I deem both of these marriage valid, but you have a mitigating circumstance, but you can go ahead and receive communion and it's only a venial sin. No, what's being said is this marriage was not valid in the first place. Therefore, you receiving communion, you have one valid marriage, so there's no sin on you, venial or otherwise. It's a declaration of nullity in the internal forum where an external forum is impossible. That's all it's saying.
That's exactly all it's saying. And there's another complication here too, which are mixed marriages, Protestant Catholic.
Right.
And because the church recognizes the validity of Protestant marriage, because these are marriages contracted between two baptized Catholics, you sometimes often have a situation, and I know some people I know fall into this category, where you have the Catholic spouse who wants to proceed with an annulment, but the Protestant spouse says, "No way, I'm not cooperating. I'm not doing that."
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't believe in that nonsense. And yet that Protestant spouse is also divorced and also needs an annulment, and yet won't get it. And so what do you do? I'm sorry, there's beeping going on here.
Oh, that's okay.
So what do you do in a situation like that? Do you just does the pastor then say to the Catholic spouse, "Well, you're just out of luck. Sorry about that. Nothing I can do, my hands are tied? Or does he delve into the situation pastorally?
Does he do what a pastor is supposed to do, like be
Exactly.
pastoral and help people, and
Exactly.
and that's the thing. You said Pope Francis is not like John Paul the Great. He's not like Pope Benedict. I would say that Pope Francis, he's the manifestation of he's like a pastor's pastor. This man, I don't see him as the most theologically erudite. He doesn't make grand expositions, that kind of thing, like Benedict, but he's a pastor's pastor. He has a pastor's heart. I had my old pastor tell me, in my former Protestant church, he said, I'm so happy that you came all the way home to the Catholic Church, and I love what Pope Francis is doing. So for people to say only theological liberals and sellouts can admire things that Pope Francis has done is simply
nonsense.
It's nonsense.
It's nonsense. Like I said, I'm no huge fan of Pope Francis,
And you don't have to be, right?
there's a part of me that likes something about him, which is that I say this with some trepidation, fully aware that I'm ignorant, but I don't think he is as personally holy as, say, a Benedict or a John Paul or either, because. And this resonates with me in some ways because I think Pope Francis can actually be a bit of a scold. I think I think he can be kind of petty,
Grumpy. Yeah.
I think he can be a little bit petty, somewhat vindictive at times.
Yeah.
He holds grudges and he gets angry, and that is me. So, that's who I am. I can be petty. I can hold grudges. I can lose my temper. I'm kind of volatile. And I think that's Pope Francis. I think he wears his emotions on his sleeves, and I think he can be. So, for example, I'm not a big fan of the motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes. I think it was a bit petty. I think it was shooting flies with a bazooka. But nevertheless, there's also a certain endearing quality in all of that. Pope Francis is extremely he's a guy you'd sit down and have a beer with.
Yeah. He's transparent.
Yeah,
He
there's no guile.
Right. He doesn't try to, quote unquote, fake the funk, as it were. And it's funny because today's St. Jerome's feast day, and St. Jerome was kind of a grump, right? And kind of vindictive, but he's a saint.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's hope for Pope Francis. There's hope for all of us, right?
And look, this idea that Pope Francis is liberal is just risible nonsense.
Yeah, let's deal with that. Yeah.
Let's look at, for example, the wish list of liberal Catholics. Like I said, I'm 62, almost 63. I grew up surrounded by the dominance of liberal Catholicism in the post-Vatican II era. I know what these people want. I was also in the Theological Guild, which is still dominated by progressive liberal Catholics. Here's what they want. They want a wholesale change in the church's sexual teaching. They want contraception. They want divorce and remarriage. They want a green light to sort of premarital sex because people get married later these days, the argument goes. And therefore, what's wrong with two people living together for 4, 5, 6, 7 years before they finally tie the knot? So they want contraception, all that kind of stuff. They also want women priests. They want women deacons. They want married priests. They want intercommunion with Protestants. Willy-nilly. And Pope Francis has granted none of that to them.
None.
Not a single one of those issues has he budged on or moved the needle on. So I'm a little bit at a loss when I hear some of my traditionalist friends say, oh, this Pope is so liberal. It makes me wonder if they know what a liberal Catholic actually looks like.
You would know because you were there during the
Oh,
the
yeah.
silliness,
I mean, come on. I mean, you want to see a liberal Catholic? I mean, just walk around your average parish and talk to sort of an average, ordinary Catholic who thinks, well, I think the church should change its teaching on blah, 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 all the way down the line. So, okay, so I'm talking to a Protestant who prays the rosary. So, Francis has not granted them any of their wish lists.
Right. Right. And let's talk about, and not only has he not granted them, as if he's just like a passive bystander that refuses to speak on any of this. He's made positive statements about these issues. He's called gender theory demonic, oppressive. He's called abortion murder. That it's like Nazism with white.
A hitman.
Yeah, hitman. Yeah, exactly. So he recently changed or updated canon law to include certain excommunications for bishops who try to ordain same-sex couples, or
that's right.
Or sorry, ordain women.
Ordain women. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. And they incur a late sententiae excommunication.
Oh yeah.
So like he's doing things in the other direction.
By the way, we talk about the German Synod, and whoa, he hasn't done anything about the German Synod. Let me tell you, that changed the canon law. Right there, that was a shot at the German Synod.
Yeah.
And it was telling the German bishops, any one of you that dares to ordain a woman as a priest on your own, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be excommunicated.
So what about the people who say, or might be tempted to say, look, okay, I know the CDF put out that document about blessing same-sex unions. I know that the Holy Father signed off on it. But if he really was against this stuff, then he would put his foot down on the German bishops' necks and say that you guys who are in clergy, who are blessing these unions, basically in open obstinance, after we promulgated this document, you guys are saying, aha, look what we can do, and no one's going to do anything. If he really was against this stuff, he would have excommunicated a whole slew of them by now. He hasn't done it, therefore it shows that he's on their side. He's liberal.
Well, the flaw in that argument is that it proves too much, in the sense that you could make that same argument against John Paul, Benedict, Paul VI, who, despite the orthodoxy of John Paul and Benedict, their reputations for being these strict disciplinarian popes, I mean, Ratzinger, the Panzer Cardinal, and all that, is complete nonsense. Once again, I was in the seminary and then in the academy during the pontificate of John Paul II, and the idea that John Paul II was some sort of rampant disciplinarian, smacking theologians around left and right, is utter nonsense. The church continued sub rosa, underneath the umbrella of orthodoxy, sort of evading the radar. They were still extremely progressive and extremely liberal. So, I mean, for example, John Paul issued Ex Corde Ecclesiae, that document on universities, Catholic universities. And in there was that famous thing about the mandatum, that any Catholic theologian teaching in a Catholic school needs to get a mandatum from the local bishop testifying to their orthodoxy. Nobody paid any attention to that.
Yeah, right.
And many, many bishops, all they did was granted a blanket mandatum to everybody teaching in their diocese.
How convenient.
And so anybody that knows anything about Catholic higher education in Western Europe and the United States and Canada knows that it is a hotbed of dissent and insanity.
Sure.
Still, to this day, despite... So in other words, why didn't John Paul wield the whip? Why didn't he call the Jesuit superior into Rome and say, look, you got all these Jesuit universities in Europe and North America that are spouting theological heresy. If you don't clean up your act, I'm going to suppress every single one of those places.
Yeah, exactly. And here's a
but he didn't. But he didn't.
Exactly. And speaking of Benedict, many people don't know this, right? The ultra-Orthodox German Rottweiler, right? He gave Roger Taze communion. Roger Taze was a Protestant. At St. John Paul the Great's funeral, he gave Roger Taze communion.
I did not know that.
He did.
Wow. That's really... And did he ever explain why he did?
I don't believe so. I know there was a picture. I saw the picture, the photograph. This was some years back. But it was the Taze community was like a... ecumenical sort of thing, and it was very sympathetic. Roger Taze, was very sympathetic to Catholicism.
Is it pronounced Taze or Taze or
Taze or Taze? But he did give Roger Taze communion.
I didn't know that, and that's really interesting.
Yeah. So here again, Mr.
I'm not certain actually that I would agree with that, but
right.
But that's really interesting, and I'm not gonna condemn Benedict as a heretic for doing that.
But many would.
And that's your point. That is
Exactly.
precisely your point. It doesn't matter whether we agree with it or not. The point is that here is this man who has a reputation for being the Panzer Cardinal, the ultra-Orthodox Pope. There he was handing out communion to a very, very, very high church Protestant,
Hmm.
and so we have to deal with that. And what it says about, well, who Pope Benedict really was and what he really thought. And what it actually shows further is many of these caricatures of the popes are media driven and politicized. The
Hmm.
fact is, neither John Paul or Benedict were these rabid right wing disciplinarians, nor is Pope Francis some sort of ultra left wing liberal progressive.
Right. They're all in the middle.
None of these caricatures are true. None of them.
So,
And they're driven by agendas.
mhm, exactly. So it's like people want you to either play in, they want you in two camps. You're either the left, here's the line in the sand. You're either the radical left or you're the radical right. No, no, no. Orthodoxy is in the middle, always has been.
Yeah.
So yeah, the thing about the Amoris Laetitia, I think, is really wrongheaded. Could it have been clarified better so that there wasn't this hoopla and misunderstanding? Sure, but that's a prudential thing, right? I mean,
But you see, this is why I said I'm not a huge fan of Pope Francis,
right?
because he seems to enjoy letting ambiguity twist in the wind. And
Yeah.
I don't know why that is, because I don't think that he's a liberal or a heretic or any of those sorts of things.
Hmm.
I don't know why he just sorts of lets things hang like that, but he does.
He
But anyway,
does.
I interrupted you, and I'm
N-
sorry.
Oh no, brother, that's good. That's good. No, you're totally right. And that actually goes to my point is that I'm not going to make a moral judgment on the Holy Father, the Supreme Pontiff. Um, but we can criticize. We can criticize. We can talk about prudential actions and words. And so we've got somebody in here. Um, I knew it was a matter of time. God bless YouTuber Saint Martin. When we were talking about the Catholic universities, he said, "Oh yes, this was before. Sorry, bright lights like John Senior were snuffed out." And then he says,
Right.
"Oh yes, Pope Francis knows what he's doing." Well, again, with all due respect, my brother, that is speculation. The only way you can know that with certitude is if you had the gift of reading souls like Saint Padre Pio. None of us. And he's an anti-prophetic figure, and he's eerie. Well, again, see, this is the danger that we're talking about. So
What does that even mean?
I don't know. I guess because he fits the profile of the big bad wolf and the Jack Chick tracks. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean,
if you can't make a moral judgment about the man, you're bearing false witness. How exactly?
I don't under. Christ said, "Judge not, lest you be judged," and he didn't mean by that you can't make moral adjudications in an objective way. What he meant
Yeah,
was you can't peer into the soul of another human being
exactly.
and make final adjudications about their moral status before God. And Pope Francis has not said or done anything that I would deem to be immoral.
Yes, and Saint Martin, let me challenge you then. I normally don't do this with my YouTube viewers, but since you're very adamant, I'm going to entertain you. My contention, like Brother Larry has already stated, is that I don't think Pope Francis is the greatest pope we've ever had. I'm not a fangirl. Okay, so let's get that straight.
That's
But
right.
what I'm saying is that I don't think he's a heretic.
Right.
Can I have my views and leanings about certain prudential things that he's said or done? Sure. I don't think he's a heretic. So I'm challenging you to bring up instances where you think that he has committed. Now, remember the church's definition of heresy, the obstinate denial of a dogma of the Catholic Church. Don't just throw the
Right.
H word around.
Right.
Use it as the church herself uses it. I'm challenging you to bring up one instance where Pope Francis has denied obstinately a denial of the Catholic faith. Tell me how he's a heretic. So we've already dealt with Amoris Laetitia.
Yeah.
The next thing I wanted to bring up was the Abu Dhabi statement with the Grand Imam Al Tayyib,
Yeah. Yeah.
promoting the death job or the death jab. Oh, COVID, brother. Don't you know what? If you bring up that nonsense in here, I've never had to block somebody before. If you bring up that vaccination stuff, that anti-COVID stuff, I can't even. No, I'm telling you, do something about faith and morals. Don't tell me the vaccine. Now, if you believe that the Catholic Church is the instrument through which Christ teaches and governs, and the CDF has said that it is morally permissible to receive the vaccine. It's not saying you have to do it. If it's against your conscience, don't. But you tell me something about faith and morals that the Pope has taught that is heretical.
Exactly. I mean, I have not, I've gotten COVID and survived it, and I have not gotten the vaccine, and I have not gotten it for reasons of moral conscience.
Yeah, and you're fine with that. That's
And
totally
I'm totally
cool.
fine with that, but I'm also totally fine with any Catholic that does get the vaccine.
Yes, and this is what this is the disposition
Right.
that the CDS asks us to have. Now, with regards to the statement of Pope Francis and the Grand Imam, Pope Francis got a lot of fire for this one, where he says that God wills the diversity of religion. So,
Yeah.
what's up with that?
Well, I think actually it was a deeply problematic statement on his part. I wish he had not said it. The interesting thing is this, is that Pope Francis has said on numerous occasions that Christ is central to salvation,
Yep.
that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way to salvation. Now, okay, so that's part and parcel also with the church's teaching that there's no salvation outside of the church. But you have to understand what all of that means. What does it mean that you're saved in Christ and in the church? It doesn't mean you necessarily have to be an explicit Christian or an explicit member of the church, that there are ways that non-Christians, can be saved. And so, I mean, that's the teaching of Lumen Gentium 16, the Second Vatican Council, numerous popes, and so on. That's very orthodox. But it seems to me that Pope Francis did step in a big cow pie here by saying that God wills the pluralism of religions. Because I don't think that's true. I don't think God does will the pluralism of religions. But the thing is this, I don't really know what Pope Francis meant by that.
Okay.
And the thing is, the Vatican later sort of backpedaled and said, well, no, it is not church teaching that God wills the pluralism of religions.
Yeah, he actually clarified to Bishop Athanasius Schneider what he meant.
Oh, that's good. I didn't know that. Good.
Yeah, so my initial thought was he doesn't permit it actively as a means of salvation. He allows it. And of course, we have to remember that
So is permissive will.
it's permissive will.
Yeah,
But
okay.
right back to St. Justin Martyr, I mean, we have him saying that the Greek philosophers were the first Christians. So because of the seeds of the logos, right? It's not.
See, exactly. This is what he was really saying, I think. Logoi spermatikoi, Justin Martyr. This is what he was saying. There are seeds of the word in other religions. He was he was trying to say what the church teaches, but I think it came across in a bad way.
Wrong. Exactly.
Right.
Like even St. Thomas Aquinas taught implicit baptism of desire, not just explicit. This is a teaching that we've had for literally 2,000 years.
Oh, yeah.
We've always had it. It's not Vatican II's invention. And now we do have a question from Christopher Roberts. Saint Martin goes on to say PF is a shocking scandal, much worse than Alexander VI. Okay, well, I haven't seen
okay.
Pope Francis commit any public orgies and all that. But okay.
So here, this is actually, I mean, I don't agree with I think the motives of the questioner here, but it's a great question to raise because this is why it's important that we've had this conversation about whether or not Pope Francis is a heretic or not.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of ultra-traditionalists who claim that Pope Francis is the worst pope in history because he actually teaches heresy.
Yes, he damages
So,
souls. Yeah.
whereas someone like Alexander was guilty of moral turpitude.
Yes.
And that all of the really awful popes in the history of the church were simply guilty of moral failings.
Yes, they didn't try to change doctrine, but Pope Francis is doing that. So he's
exactly.
worse.
They were guilty of sexual stuff and nepotism and various other corruptions, but they weren't guilty of heresy. Pope Francis is guilty of heresy. I'm sorry. I respectfully disagree with the charge that the Pope is guilty of heresy. I do not think that he is. And because he is far more moral than an Alexander, I would submit to you that you should reconsider whether or not he's the worst pope in history.
Yeah, maybe read some more church history. I mean, one of the
Yeah,
one,
it's
shoot,
nonsense. I
what,
mean, it's hair curling to
I,
read what some of the popes were like.
I mean, like let's one of the popes. I forget it was Paul the something or other. I can't recall off the top of my head, but I do know. Now we talk about Pope Francis as a heretic because he gave a nod to other religions. Well, how about this? How about a pope throwing dice and toasting to pagan gods, Jupiter and Saturn?
Yeah.
How about that? Is that a threat to faith or morals? Well, yeah, because you're literally legitimizing pagan gods as idols and you're worshiping them and offering them sacrifice.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah, popes that were sodomites, and
yeah,
you know, it's incredible. And to think that there isn't an implied heresy in that kind of immoral behavior is also a strange sort of bifurcation between theology and practical living. I mean, when a pope has mistresses and children, then you have to start to wonder whether or not he's not teaching through his life,
what about that? Yeah,
you know, that the moral teaching of the church on human sexuality is false.
right. Wouldn't that give you the implication if you heard about what the Pope had done? Well, if the
I mean,
Pope can do it, sure
I
can
mean,
I.
let's put this in perspective. Let's say, for example, that we discover after the fact that Pope John Paul II was actually a person that had all kinds of mistresses, that sort of, he was like the John F. Kennedy of the papacy, and that he had all these women coming into his boudoir at nighttime and so on.
Yeah.
And that on every single one of his trips on the papal plane, his aides made sure that he had various women available to him and so on. This is what we need. I mean, this is the moral equivalent of what ancient popes were doing.
Right.
Right. And we need to therefore put in perspective Pope Francis and whether or not he really rises to that level of perfidy, because he most certainly does not.
And
You know, by all
here,
accounts, he's a man of a certain humble simplicity.
yeah, simplicity is a good word. Now we have things like this. Hitler's life was more moral. You know what? I'm sorry, man. Beloved, if you can't, like I challenged you already, you can't step up. You're just spouting insults now, and you're
Who is
casting.
who is watching this? I mean, that's got to be the most insane thing I've heard in like 3 weeks.
Well, there you have it. It happened on our show. So
Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah,
so Pope Francis is worse than Hitler. This
yeah.
kind of stuff.
Okay.
I mean, like if he can't, like I said, bring up a clear example. See, what we're talking about, Larry, is we're talking about substantive issues. Okay, we're talking
Yeah,
about complex issues. If
yeah.
somebody can't respond in kind and say, I think he's a heretic because X, Y, and Z, instead of spouting off these things, then I really don't know what to say. I'm just not going to acknowledge it.
Well,
It's kind of, it's kind of disheartening.
it's what you have to put up with social media these days. I mean, somebody with the IQ of 27 can post on the internet. So, you know,
Another thing, another thing I wanted to talk about was Pachamama. Right now, we talked about
oh,
the difference between heresy
oh
and
man,
prudentiality, right?
yeah,
So, look, I'm going to throw my cards on the table. I don't think that what happened in 2019 is done in the best way, kind of like Assisi, right? However,
exactly.
I will say something, and that is, okay, first of all, what we talked about already, the seeds of the logos. So we don't just see types, shadows, and symbols of the church and the life and religion of Israel. That we see super eminently, but we see it in all nations, times, and places, because Christ and Our Lady and the church is the hope of all nations, not just Israel, but it is cemented, it is centered in Israel, it is concentrated in Israel. Why do we see Horus, Isis, and Osiris in Egypt in the form of like a trinity or a mother holding a child? Because God put it into the hearts of man that this is what I'm going to do something like this, but perfect and beautiful. So
Yeah,
we see this in every culture. Now I want to tell you something. Archbishop Fulton Sheen of happy memory.
I
Everybody,
love. Yeah,
he's an enemy of modernism. He's ultra orthodox, conservative. He wouldn't stand for Pope Francis's crap. Okay, there's a YouTube. It's on YouTube. The World's First Love or The Woman I Love, one of the two. I have the clip. He said a missionary in China gave him a statue of Kuan Yin, the Chinese goddess of mercy with many arms. He kept that statue of a Chinese goddess on his desk in his personal study.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Why? Because he sees in that figure a type and foreshadowing of the Virgin Mary. Christ and the Virgin Mary are the deified, perfect fulfillment, realization of all of the imperfect pagan religions, but all that is good, true, and beautiful in them without the distortions and errors. And that's what we're seeing in the Amazon Synod and this Pachamama fiasco. Now, I want to just let everybody know, if you survey Christian art history, many of the images of Christ that we have, or one of the earliest ones is Christ as a pagan philosopher. He doesn't have long hair. He doesn't even have a beard. He's a white guy in a dalmatic. So some of the earliest images of Christ we have are based on pagan templates, but because that image has been baptized and the intent of veneration to that image is not its template, its old template, but what has replaced it and been fulfilled in it, i.e. Christ. Per the Second Council of Nicaea, veneration of images of Christ and the saints go to their archetype. Okay, so Pachamama, right, the Andean goddess, all that is good, true, and beautiful in her is fulfilled in the Virgin Mary. And this wasn't something that was thought up in 2019 in October. For 400 years, and if people don't believe me, they can go to Michael Lofton's channel, Reason and Theology. They can watch the video on the Amazon Synod and whether the Pope promoted idolatry. He shows a screenshot of a 400-year-old image of Pachamama and the Virgin Mary's face on a mountainous body. So Pachamama has been identified with the Virgin Mary in that region, not since the Vatican Garden thing in 2019, but for 400 years, when the Jesuits were the Orthodox good guys. People just don't know their history. That is the problem.
They don't. What you've just said has provoked so many thoughts in my mind. First off, I've read articles that were interviews at the time with various people in South America, where Pachamama, is from. And some of those people will say exactly what you just said. It's a prefigurement of the Virgin Mary. It's perfectly okay that the Pope wants to use it as a tool of enculturation to lead pagan peoples to a proper veneration of Mary, that sort of thing. Then you read other articles that interviewed other people that said, no, Pachamama was a demon goddess, and so it's horrible that the Vatican is doing this and so on. So just on a strictly empirical level, I don't know, since I'm ignorant, what to believe about what the Pachamama image really represents to most indigenous peoples in South America. But I will say this. I think what we're looking at is, once again, if you read Pope Francis, it's very clear he thinks Christ is the sole mediator of salvation.
Amen.
He's not a syncretist. He doesn't believe that all religions are equal. It's just different. So you're forced then by strict logic and charity to say, at worst, this was simply a ham-handed attempt at a certain optic, a certain media optic led by some Germans who were running the synod.
Some white dudes in an ivory tower that didn't know their head from their foot.
Yeah. Hey, let's toss a Pachamama in there and bring in the damn Indians with their headdress and shit. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. But I really think that's kind of what this was a bunch of old Germans trying to figure out how to be relevant, trying to be hip with the people of the Amazon, so we're going to trot Pachamama in here and show how cool we are. But the deeper issue that you are entirely correct about, the Fulton Sheen story and the images of Christ in early Christianity. I remember going on the Scavi tour underneath St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I don't know if you've ever done that. If you get, it's where the bones of St. Peter are. It's that first century cemetery that they discovered during the reign of Pius XII under the Vatican. And you look at it's a cemetery, so you look at the various burial chambers that are down there. And the tour guide, I've been on the tour 4 or 5 times, and one of the tour guides pointed out an image of Christ in one of the tombs that was like an image of a young man who looked like kind of an Adonis.
Yes.
And it was Christ. And she pointed out that this was actually Christ as kind of Apollo.
Yep.
And it's because the church had not yet committed itself to the sort of iconography of Jesus that we're now familiar with.
Exactly. That's exactly my point. And whether the Pachamama thing was a ham-handed attempt of trying to be relevant, the fact remains that 400 years prior, pre-Vatican II, that she was seen as a type of Mary by Orthodox Catholics who were trying to evangelize the region. That's the takeaway.
And yet you have ultra-traditionalists in the United States who actually paid people to go to Rome and throw the Pachamama statues into the Tiber River, which is theft. And I hope this person, who everybody knows, never tries to go to Rome again, ever, because he'll probably be detained for aiding and abetting a crime, which was stealing. And of course, this person would justify this on the grounds, well, idolatry is idolatry. But this only goes to show the extremism with which we are dealing right now with the ultra-traditionalists, that they will even resort to sinful activities, theft.
He was just doing what St. Boniface did.
Oh, Boniface chopped down the pagan tree and all that. Well, I'm sorry, this is not the same. And you're not St. Boniface. And the day that you rise to the level of St. Boniface, then maybe you have the moral credibility to do such a thing. Otherwise, shut up. All right? Yeah. And stop this nonsense, this clickbait nonsense, by the way, which is making you money.
Yeah, now, like you said, I don't think people are aware. Now, the gentleman who went into Rome and took the statue and threw it into the river.
The Austrian guy, yeah.
Yeah, the Austrian guy who coincidentally caught COVID.
Yeah.
Right? But here's the thing. People thought that was a random act of heroism. And then the gentleman who then interviewed him lauded him as, hey, this is the first time I'm meeting you. You're my hero. But guess what? That gentleman paid the other gentleman to go and do it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And nobody knew that at the time.
Right.
That video was presented, that there was this collusion behind the scenes between the two of them. Hey, look, I kind of like that Austrian guy. He seemed like a nice enough guy.
Yeah, sure.
A young, very energetic Catholic, and he thought he was doing the right thing. So I'm not here to condemn him.
No.
God bless him. He threw a bunch of stupid wooden statues into the Tiber. God knows how many also other awful things have been thrown into the Tiber River over the centuries. So I harbor no animus against him or anything like that. But
it wasn't really his fault. Yeah.
But let's be honest here. How about some authenticity? How's some honesty? And not try to hide what's really going on here behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, if the Pachamama thing was a ham-handed attempt at sort of optics, which is media optics, which I think is what all it really amounted to. Mm-hmm. And you've mounted a counter argument that I think is also actually very persuasive about it being a prefigurement of Mary, which is what I think Pope Francis thinks, by the way.
That's what he thinks, I think, yeah.
Because he sort of said so. Not sort of said so, he said so.
Yeah, let's remember that final document on the Amazon Synod, guess what? He said Our Lady is the true Lady of the Amazon at the very end.
Document, yeah, go ahead.
But here's the thing. It was so darn good, that document, that Church Militant praised it.
Absolutely. Even Michael Voris praised it. The thing is, I wrote an article in Catholic World Report on Querida Amazonia, I think is the name of the document.
That's right.
In which I praised it and said, looky here. The Pope actually did not grant the liberal Germans who ran the synod, their desires for a female diaconate, and in fact, he really kind of crushed any hope for any. He said, "Look, let's not pursue this clericalism of trying to clericalize the laity and stuff. Why don't we try kind of evangelizing? Let's try that. Let's try that." And so Querida Amazonia was the Pope's way of saying, kind of, hey, you know what? We're still Catholics. And I think it's very, very clear that he wanted to say that the Pachamama thing was a prefigurement of Mary, who is the true Queen of the Americas. Absolutely.
Amen. Now, I did want to throw some light on some comments here. So Tom says, I believe the display was a mistake. And that's the thing, Tom. I kind of agree with you. So people think just because I gave an apologia for the sort of the meat of the thing, do I think it was carried out in the proper way? No, because all you have to do is look at its effects. Did it unite Catholics? No, it didn't. Was the right intention behind Assisi? Yeah, I would say so. And guess what? Here's a gem for you, Dr. Chapp. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I read it was an African cardinal's autobiography. And for the life of me, it wasn't Turkson. It wasn't Sarah. I wish I could remember the cardinal's name, but those African cardinals don't play. They are super ultra orthodox and they don't play no nonsense games. But this African cardinal was actually defending in his autobiography Assisi. And he was saying, look, this is what we intended. Now, some Buddhist placed the statue on a Christian altar where the Eucharist is confected. That was a mistake. They didn't know what they were doing, and we didn't know that they were even going to do it. It was just a display of goodwill, and neither of us knew that this was going to take place. So the way that it kind of played out, it wasn't in the best way, but that's not what we intended. And I think the same could probably be said about the Pachamama thing. Now, Tom also said what I said about the prefigurative of Mary. He said that may be true, but many, many South Americans believe she's a goddess. But yeah, that's exactly my point, brother, is that Christ had an image of Apollo. Did people think Apollo was a goddess? Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
So it's like it's univocal here. What has happened with the type and the fulfillment?
What are we really claiming here? Okay, I mean, I appreciate Tom's question. It's a good question.
Sure, it's a good question. Yes,
and it's offered in good faith.
Yes,
but let's draw out its full implications. If what we're saying is the Pachamama, I'll stipulate, okay, for the sake of argument, Pachamama is considered a goddess in South America. What are we claiming here? That Pope Francis is promoting goddess worship? That he wants Catholics now to syncretistically simply adopt goddess worship in our churches in Latin America? That in Catholic churches in Brazil and in the Amazon, that they go ahead, set up goddess worship. Go ahead, do your goddess worship. Do we really think that's what Pope Francis was promoting? Of course he wasn't promoting that. Of course
not. Just look at the final document.
Yeah, what he's promoting is the idea that goddess worship is a prefigurement of the Virgin Mary in very disfigured and distorted ways, but still a prefigurement.
That's it. And this isn't something that Pope Francis or Vatican II thought of. Let me remind you, this is 2,000 years old in doctrine and practice. Okay. Yeah. So let's get a good grasp on church history before we make statements like, and I'm not saying you, Tom, your question was again.
No, Tom's question was a good one. It's a very good one. Good question.
He's a good brother. I've spoken to him on the phone. He's a wonderful guy. And I know that was asked in good faith. So it deserves a response, a good response.
Yeah. And the thing, the Assisi thing,
let's talk about that because you lived through that.
I did, and it's often brought up as an accusation against Saint Pope John Paul II. And I think that it has taken on legendary status that far surpasses anything that's warranted. I think it's greatly exaggerated, and a lot of the ultra-traditionalists that bring up, well, what about Assisi? I don't think have actually ever read anything that John Paul said actually at Assisi.
About it, yeah.
What John Paul said in his various talks at Assisi was totally in line with church teaching with regard to the logoi spermatikoi in the various religions of the world. He might have been a little too irenic, a little too sort of conciliatory towards those little seeds of the word in
Yes.
other religions, but it must be remembered that he was engaged in interreligious dialogue, and that was not the time to stand up and point a finger at a Buddhist and say, you know what, you're worshiping demons.
And you're going to hell.
And you're going to hell for worshiping demons. You know, and so if anything, John Paul could maybe be faulted with an excess of hospitality.
Sure.
Which the sort of Buddhist statue on the altar and that sort of thing. I mean, after the fact, what do you do about when somebody of goodwill does something like that? Like, all right, you know, and you just go on.
Right. And G.K. Chesterton said, anytime a man enters a brothel, he's seeking for God.
Yeah, I love that quote from Chesterton.
Yes.
That is so true. And what John Paul is simply trying to do in the spirit of Lumen Gentium and Vatican II is to sort of pull the thorn out of the lion's paw here, in a sense, of people who think, people in other religions, non-Christian religions, who think that the Catholic Church teaches that they're going to hell because they're not Catholics. It is still really a dominant mentality that a lot of non-Catholics have, Protestant and Jewish and other religions, that the Catholic Church's official teaching is that if you're not a Catholic, you're going to hell.
Card-carrying member, yeah.
Yeah, and you're exactly. If you're not a baptized Catholic, you're going to hell. And this is a mentality that John Paul was trying to diffuse. He was trying to pull that thorn out of that lion's paw. And that carried, I mean, I know Pope Benedict actually has certain issues with what Pope John Paul did at Assisi. I have certain issues.
Of course.
Look, for example, I have a big issue with the fact of that picture of John Paul kissing the Koran.
Yeah.
That just sends willy-nillys up my spine when I see him kissing the Koran.
Agreed.
I wish he had not done that. So I'm not above criticizing any pope, even my hero, John Paul. But he wasn't a heretic. He wasn't a syncretist. Can we just dial back the red-pilled rhetoric that what all of this, from Pachamama to John Paul kissing the Koran, that what this represents is papal endorsement of religious syncretism or religious relativism? It is simply not the case. It was under John Paul's watch that Ratzinger, head of the CDF, issued that document, Dominus Jesus.
Dominus Jesus. Yeah, exactly.
That reiterated strongly Christ is the only path to salvation.
Yes.
How you could then interpret the sort of imprudent moves here and there that John Paul made in religious dialogue, okay, as syncretism is simply an uncharitable desire to paint John Paul in the worst possible light.
It's unjust.
It is
what it is. It is unjust. Now,
it is.
You know, and people will say, well, okay, fine. Doctrinally, they said the right things, but their practice is really, it really shows forth what they believe. No, I don't think that's true in this case. I think we're human beings. Sometimes, you know, we have certain ideas, and the way we express them is not always in the best way. But that doesn't mean that faulty expression is really in our heart of hearts what we hold. We're human beings, and we're fallen, and we're limited.
I mean, just look at, how many countries did John Paul visit?
Mm-hmm.
All over the world, millions of people saying Mass. And his message, no matter where he went, whether it was Poland or Mexico or Singapore or in the Philippines, were the largest gathering of human beings ever recorded on the history of planet Earth, took place in the Philippines, where John Paul held Mass in front of like 5 million people, 6 million people.
That's incredible. Wow.
Okay. And in every single case, what did he do? He preached Christ and Christ crucified.
Crucified. Yes, sir.
Okay. So the accusation that because he once kissed a Koran or whatever, or he said some nice things about Buddhism in Assisi, that this proves that he was some kind of relativist or syncretist is so irritating because it is so uncharitable, and it bespeaks an agenda-driven and ideologically driven desire to paint John Paul in the worst possible light for the simple sake of proving that all post-Vatican II popes are heretics.
That's it.
So that we can return to, and Pius XII, by the way, isn't even good enough for these people, because after all, he reintroduced things like the Easter Vigil, and he modified the liturgy in 1955, and he issued like Divino Afflante Spiritu, which sort of okayed certain things, and Mystici Corpus Christi, which justified certain. I mean, Pius XII was actually the Pope of Vatican II. Pius XII is the Pope that paved the path for Vatican II. So for a lot of ultra-traditionalists who understand this, he's not even pure enough. You have to go back to Pius X and Pascendi and all that. So you keep peeling back the layers of this stupid onion of purity and pure orthodoxy. And before long, I guarantee you, they're going to find reasons that Pius X wasn't pure enough. And this is a game that just cannot be played.
And it doesn't end. It doesn't end.
It does not end. And it doesn't mean you can never criticize a pope. We've done our fair share of criticizing popes here tonight.
Sure.
Even my theological hero, John Paul II, I have criticized. But this move of late by the ultra-traditionalists to, in a sense, paint all post-Vatican II popes as quasi-heretics or formal heretics, this has got to stop. And unless it stops, Bishop Robert Barron has said that these sorts of traditionalists are self-devouring, and he's absolutely correct. But what he means by that is that they're sawing off the branch on which they're sitting. You can only criticize the modern magisterium so much before you simply have to say, you know what, I don't believe in the magisterium.
No, it falsifies Catholicism. That's what it does.
It does.
So either Catholicism is true, Christ built this church and he made a promise. Either he's God, he is who he says he is, and he keeps his promise, or he's not.
Yeah.
Let's pack it up and go home. It's
essentially a form of Catholic Protestantism where you're setting yourself up as the final arbiter of what the tradition means. This pope is okay, this one's not okay. And we're going to roll back the clock until we find a pope that's okay by our standards. I'm sorry, that's not Catholic.
This is kind of Lutheranism, because Lutherans wanted to get back to the pure church, right? So
that's all it is.
You got to pull back the onion until you get far enough. You get the Book of Acts, and then Protestant pastors, how often do they say we want to create the Book of Acts church?
The thing is this, though, too, because what we're talking about here is a Protestant principle where you identify some point in the history of the church where there was a rupture from the true church to the false church. Mm-hmm. And over time, when that rupture happens, keeps getting pushed further and further back in time, to the point now where you have liberal Protestant scripture scholars in particular, who would point to the fact that already the rupture is happening within the scriptural apostolic world itself.
Correct.
Okay, so you can already find a kind of nascent Catholicism in some of the late Pauline writings and so forth.
Of course.
And so you find already that, in other words, what was that book? I don't know who wrote it. Oh God, I can't think. But Jesus preached the kingdom, and we got the church instead.
Oh,
But already the New Testament is preaching about the church. So you find certain radical liberal exegetes who are saying the rupture is happening within the apostolic world itself. The teachings of Jesus were already corrupted by the apostles themselves.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so where you want to identify the spirit of rupture, if you're going to base it on some criterion that you develop yourself, this is a Protestant principle that is very dangerous. Yes. Very, very, very dangerous. And you end up, therefore, with simply a historically reconstructed Jesus as your only source of authority. And the historical reconstruction is itself simply a Rorschach inkblot test that simply is you projecting into Jesus whatever you actually want to see there. Albert Schweitzer pointed that out in 1905, in his book, The So-Called Quest for the Historical Jesus, where all of the reconstructions of the historical Jesus were simply reflections of the zeitgeist of the reconstructors.
Yeah.
And that's true of modern Catholic traditionalists as well. They're not really identifying anything truly objective, where there was some sort of rupture in the history. All they're identifying are their own prejudices.
Yeah, and essentially that's what it is. I mean, the difference between Protestantism and what these guys are bringing to the table is it's the same substantive thing. At a certain point, the church went off the rails. The only difference is the Catholic has a later date of rupture than the Protestant does.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. And the ultra-traditionalists are going to find eventually, as they peel back the layers of that onion, that they're not going to find any era of the church that was as pure as they want it to be.
No, and that's the thing that Mike Aquilina taught me a while ago. He said the greatest misconception, you want to know how to deal with the crisis in the church? Well, you have to adjust your mind frame. And how you adjust your mind frame is you get hip to the reality that there never was a golden age of the church. Never.
No.
Never was.
Not even in the apostolic era.
Just read the New Testament. People are committing incest in Corinth.
Yeah.
Like,
or worse in some sense, Paul and Peter can't see eye to eye. You know.
But see, Peter, Paul corrected Peter. Therefore, we can rail against the Holy Father. It's apples and oranges. He's talking about his discipline. He's talking about his practice. He's not even talking about his doctrine.
Not only that, Paul was an apostle to whom the risen Christ appeared. So when I find a modern ultra traditionalist to whom the risen Christ has appeared, then maybe I'll listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, that might change things, eh?
Yeah. In other words, Paul had a certain gravitas and a certain warrant for opposing Peter to his face. There's a reason why sometimes the primacy of the Pope is not simply rooted in Christ's promises to Peter, but the fact that both Paul and Peter were martyred in Rome. I think that's important to remember.
I agree. And Christopher Roberts actually has a question for you. I wanted to talk a little bit about the liturgy and the Pope's purview over the liturgy, if you wouldn't mind. How are you doing for time? You okay?
I'm totally okay. I lit my second cigar and.
Okay, I might have to get a refill on my drink in just a sec here.
Well,
if you don't mind.
Me too.
Okay, well, we might have to take a 5-second break here, but let's ask this. Get this question from Chris here. So, will you please ask Dr. Chapp if he attends an ordinary at parish? I thought I read that in one of his articles. If so, where does he see it fitting into the liturgical? It's funny because we were just going to talk about liturgy. I didn't even know that was part of the question.
Great question. I do attend an Anglican ordinary at Catholic liturgy in Scranton. In fact, the house that I'm sitting in here is our second house. We have our farm, our Catholic worker farm, but our second house here is 1 block away from our ordinariate parish. That's how involved we are in it, because our ordinariate parish is actually 1 hour away from our farm. And so we bought this house to be closer to it when we have to be. We love the intentional community that is here with all these converts, but also we love the sheer gorgeous beauty of this ordinariate liturgy. And so
you're so lucky. Blessed.
I am blessed. I mean, in my mind, let's put it this way. I'm not an ultra-traditionalist who says the Novus Ordo needs to go and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I do believe that the liturgical reform was botched. I
agree.
I think that the Novus Ordo has deep flaws that need to be reformed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's the horrible, terrible, demonic Freemason thing that the ultra-traditionalists make it out to be. I think it can be done reverently and beautifully, and I grew up my whole life being nurtured by it in very beautiful ways.
Yes, sir.
But I do think that it needs upgrade. Like the ordinary liturgy, the priest prays ad orientem, facing away from the people. There's tons and tons of chant.
Yes.
There's lots and lots of incense. In other words, it's bells and smells, baby, left and right. And
Yeah.
the language, though in the vernacular, is a very elevated language.
Elevated. Yeah.
We receive communion kneeling at an altar rail on the tongue with intinction. There's no communion in the hand or any of those sorts of things. In my mind, this is the Reformed liturgy that the Council Fathers had in mind.
I agree. I
You
agree.
know, I wish the Novus Ordo actually looked like the ordinary liturgy. I really do.
Yes, I agree. I think if I was to pick a liturgy that suited my taste best, and I wish I had one closer, was precisely that. Nevertheless, I make do with what I have. Now, full disclosure, people might not know this about me from watching the show or my channel, but there was a time that I almost left for Eastern Orthodoxy because I was so angry, perpetually angry at Pope Francis, at the liturgy. I would leave Mass sometimes driving
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
swearing. I was just so angry. But until a good friend of mine, he taught me about redemptive suffering, but he applied it to the Mass. And he said, apply it to the Mass when you go. He said, watch how your life changes. So I started doing things like, okay, Lord, this hymn, I don't like it. I don't like it. But if there's somebody out there in the congregation who is touched by a word or phrase in that hymn and draws closer to you, then praise you for it. I don't know what Father's going through up there on the altar, but he has holy ordained hands. Please bless him. Anything
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
frustrates me, I offer it up to you. And I got to the point where I could attend, your regular Novus Ordo. Even one time, I stumbled into a Novus Ordo that was a school mass because there's a kids' school attached to the church. Normally, I probably would have walked out because I would have been so angry. But I received communion, and I left in tears, grateful for the gift of the Eucharist. So the Lord, through redemptive suffering, completely changed my mind, and I got as fervent as remaining in communion with Rome as you could get. And I still stand. I will die on this hill. I did a
Yeah.
Facebook post some years ago where I said, if I have to suffer the rest of my Catholic life through the worst liturgies with gangs of extraordinary ministers, with crappy songs,
Oh,
I
yeah.
said, I will die upside down, crucified on Vatican Hill next to the successor of St. Peter, so help me God. And I will die on that hill not because the church is perfect. Well, she is, but I mean in her human element, but because Christ instituted this thing. I believe Christ is God and he keeps his promise. He's a promise keeper and a promise maker. And so I will remain in communion with his vicar if it cost me my life. And I still hang on that.
Yeah. You and Thomas More and
Yeah.
John Fisher and a whole host of other martyrs who stood by Rome, despite the fact that Rome has made mistakes. And look, I wrote a blog once where I pointed out I found my desire to go to the seminary
Mm-hmm.
in 1978 when I was a freshman student at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And there was a vibrant, wonderful Newman Center on the sort of campus there at the University of Nebraska. And it was unbelievably faith-filled. And the year I went, the Diocese of Lincoln still churns out tons of vocations because of that Newman Center. The year I went into the seminary, there were 25, very small diocese, by the way, in terms of numbers of Catholics. And yet that Newman Center churned out 25 guys who went into the seminary the year that I went into the seminary.
Wow.
Now, my point is this. What was the liturgy there? It was a Novus Ordo liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually guitar mass liturgy with St. Louis Jesuit music. I mean, this was 1978.
Yeah.
But the priest was Orthodox. The faith of the community was Orthodox. And the fact of the matter is that's far more important than the form of the liturgy.
Yes.
Now, looking back now, I can say, objectively speaking, the music of that liturgy, of those liturgies that I encountered, was terrible. I'm not a fan of the St. Louis Jesuits. I think
Right.
that kind of folk music post-Vatican II stuff was a fad that I'm glad has sort of now passed. And yet, nevertheless, you could have sliced through the faith in that community that was there with a knife and just right on through it thickly, because the faith of the students there was impressive, because the faith of the priest who ran the place was impressive. So now he later was accused of certain horrible things.
Things,
Yeah, it turns out. But that was later in his life. His name was Father Leonard Kalin, and it turns out later in life, when he had Parkinson's and wasn't right in his head,
Oh,
that
okay.
that he made certain sexual advances to people, like when he was in his 80s.
Oh,
Okay, so I mentioned that in case there's anybody listening who knows the situation of that priest. But when I was there, he was a dynamic, orthodox, wonderful priest. And so this is my point. Liturgy is important, but it's not of ultimate importance.
hmm
And of more importance is the faith that undergirds that liturgy.
right. And if Christ is humble enough to condescend to every altar, who
Yeah,
are we to say this mass is no good when we really understand what the mass is?
yeah.
You know,
And the Novus Ordo actually has certain virtues to it. Number one, it's in the vernacular, and I support Mass in the vernacular. I don't believe that Latin is some kind of sacrosanct language that only that God, that it's what God wants for the Catholic Church. I think it was the movement of the Holy Spirit to move the Mass into the vernacular. Just sort of all that. I sort of lost my train of thought here, but the point is the Novus Ordo. Oh, I know what it was. The priest who co-owns our Catholic Worker Farm, Father John Gribbich, I just said, he's just in the past month, he's gone to the Abbey of the Genesee in New York, in Geneseo, New York, to become a monk, a Trappist monk. But before he left, he said Mass for us in our small chapel on the farm. And one of the things that it was a Novus Ordo liturgy,
Mm.
and it was utterly simple because our chapel is small. And, we didn't have a lot of bells and smells.
hmm
But what struck me at that moment was that the simplicity of the Novus Ordo vis-a-vis the old traditional Latin Mass is actually one of its strengths. It's one of the things that the Council Fathers did want in the liturgical reform, was for the liturgy to be simpler, more Spartan, a little more streamlined. And a lot of people get upset about that. That they want a liturgy that goes on for an hour and 45 minutes
hmm
and that kind of thing. I do not, and I appreciate, and it's one of the things I like about the ordinariate liturgy is that it's a little halfway house between the simplicity of the Novus Ordo liturgy and the sort of complexity of Orthodox liturgies or the Latin Mass.
Sure.
That is sort of in between on its sort of level of complexity, which I like.
To use the Anglican phrase, the via media, right?
Oh yeah,
And let me be clear, guys. I love all liturgies equally because Christ is present in each of them. So I don't want to. I'm not bashing anything or anyone. Personally, like I was, my whole experience has been Novus Ordo. Um, Now there's a Latin Mass community about 20 minutes away from me, and people say, "Well, why don't you go there?" Because from where I'm at spiritually and familiarly, like I think it's my vocation to be an example of holiness in my liturgy where I'm planted. So I'll do things like maintain prayer hands through the liturgy. I'll receive kneeling and on the tongue, even though there's no altar rail. Like I'll do little gestures and things that show my girls and my wife where we're at is sacred space. This is not like the world. And I'm not doing that to toot my own horn, but I'm saying doing things like this and being whole, trying to be reverent where I'm planted in the best way that I can. If it sparks and it takes off, then praise God. But it's about me disposing myself to receive the sacraments and being an example to
right,
my children.
right.
So that's why I stay where I'm at. I just believe it's my vocation. That might not be somebody else's, and that's okay.
Yeah,
Um,
it's very true. And the Novus Ordo Mass has sustained the faith life of countless saints.
It has Saint Mother Teresa, Saint John
Yeah.
Paul the Great, to name a few. And I just wanted to give a shout out to, I don't know if it's Louis or Luis Rendon, but he's a new subscriber. He said I look like a Catholic gangster with and it's funny, me and you kind of look alike tonight.
Yeah, we
You got
do.
the goatee and the shaved head going on. So I'm
We
in
got
good
this.
company.
We got the same barber. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty cheap too, from what I hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, you know what, and that's just it. So what I wanted to talk about, you know what, I think I'm going to refresh my beverage here. I just got to take a
Okay.
few
Me
steps
too.
over to my couch. So I'm going to mute myself for a moment and come right back.
Me too.
All
Okay.
right.
Hang on.
Yep.
All right, I'm back.
Alrighty.
Relit my cigar, refresh my bourbon. Here we go. Here we go. I hope everybody that's watching has a cigar and a bourbon in hand as well.
Yes.
Or a drink of choice.
Yes, whether it's coffee or water. I don't want to push anything on anybody, but, go according to your conscience. That's the fun thing about Catholicism. The pint, the pipe, and the cross all go together. Again, Chesterton.
Yes.
So, I just wanted to let everybody know, or the people who aren't familiar with my channel, because this might be on Dr. Chapp's feed, and some of you might not be familiar with me. So, yes, I do talk about current church issues and apologetics, but if anyone's interested, my hobby horse is showing how Catholicism is the restoration and the fulfillment of the first temple in Jerusalem. So I actually go and show the Jewish roots, the temple roots of the Eucharist, of Marian veneration, of the papacy, and all that. So if anyone's interested and wants to know more, please check out my channel and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. But I also do stuff like this, which is equally as important. And I just want to state that I am so happy to be a Catholic. And some people might ask, how are you happy to be a Catholic when all this stuff is going on? You must be out of your mind. No, friends, it's called grace. I am an unworthy sinner, but God has touched my life in such a way that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt this is Christ's truth, and come hell or high water, it is worth everything. It is worth your life to cling on to with everything you got. So that's why I'm here doing this. And I just want to give a shout out to my friend Mike Hutchinson, who's watching. And love all you guys and appreciate all your support. So yes, Larry, let's talk a little bit about the liturgy. So I've heard, and I don't know if you can comment on this or not, but the Novus Ordo is basically it's a hodgepodge. It's a Frankenstein artificial invention. Basically, at the close of Vatican II, they had a bunch of councils under the surface. How can we appease you Protestants? How can we make our liturgy more Protestant so that you guys will not be so offended by it? This is really a nod to the Protestants, and the Novus Ordo is a Protestant heresy. Could you speak to that?
I think that this is an idea that is based on a certain truth, but it goes off the rails. It is true that the church, Paul VI, was concerned with ecumenical relations with Protestants.
Sure.
And it is true that they had input when they developed the Novus Ordo from Protestant theologians who were helping to advise them. That's all true. Mm-hmm. But the idea that the Novus Ordo is a Protestant heresy is, once again, to overuse my word, nonsense. The fact that the church wanted a liturgy that might be more attractive for converts to come into the church, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. And it wasn't just limited to Protestants. The move to the vernacular liturgy was also with an eye towards non-Christians that the church was evangelizing in places like Africa and Asia. Mm-hmm. I mean, does anybody seriously believe, for example, that the church would have exploded the way it has in Africa if we were still clinging to the Mass of 1955 or 1962, that the Mass was all in Latin, and the prayers were all silent and so on? Would we still have the same explosion of conversion that we saw in Africa without the Novus Ordo, without Mass in the vernacular? So I don't necessarily see it as a knock against the Novus Ordo, that when the Vatican was reforming the liturgy, it had an eye towards conversion, and whether or not the liturgy was going to be something that people were going to find attractive to them. I mean, the fact is, one of the reasons why the Council Fathers wanted the liturgy to be reformed was precisely because it had become so in-house. It had become so inbred. And so inaccessible. Now, it's true, there were lots of converts to the church even before the council. Sure. And many of them converted to the church because they loved the old traditional Latin Mass. And that's all true. So I'm not here to say the Latin Mass was horrible and
Of
terrible and
course.
these sorts of things, and did not inspire in its own way conversions to the faith, because it is and was a beautiful liturgy, and
Amen.
something has been lost in the translation from the TLM to the Novus Ordo that should not have been lost. Certain sacred, transcendent, vertical elements in the liturgy that should not have been done away with.
True.
But the idea that simply because there was an eye towards converts and making the liturgy more palatable to sort of non-Catholics so that we could appeal to conversion, I think there were certain flawed assumptions that were made in that regard
Mhm.
as the liturgy was reformed. But I don't think the idea in and of itself necessarily represents a Protestant heresy.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like you said about the explosion of the faith in Africa, even the global South. The majority of this is Novus Ordo. So,
Oh,
and
by
these,
the way, and I'm going to
yeah,
interrupt you for a second.
sure, yeah,
One of the things that needs to be pointed out is the traditional Latin Mass movement among ultra traditionists right now is a very, very, very British and American thing, and and to a certain extent a French thing. You take away the traditional Latin Mass communities in America especially, and you will eliminate 2/3 of the Latin Masses. In places like Africa, South America, Asia, there is hardly any movement towards the traditional Latin Mass.
yeah. That's a good point. Um, what I was gonna say was we have to remember too that now if we study the history of the liturgy, I have a great book from Jungmann, who's a
Yeah,
pre-conciliar liturgy scholar, one of the best.
yeah,
He wrote a book called The History of the Roman Rite.
yeah.
Why that's important is he surveys the development of the liturgy from the Last Supper to Trent and beyond. And I learned some very interesting things that I wasn't necessarily expecting to find. So, for example, a couple things. Communion in the hand was the universal norm, east and west, until about 878. So almost 1,000 years. That was the standard.
Yeah.
Secondly, early on in Rome, and he highlights Rome specifically, versus populum and ad orientem were done with equal frequency side by side. The earliest church altars were, first of all, wooden tables that could be moved around with a cloth placed over them. And after that, they became more fixable. They were stone altars, but just a simple altar with a white cloth over top. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you brought up the nice point about the simplicity of the Novus Ordo. This is something that was watermark of the church's early liturgies. So not only was the Novus Ordo an attempt to maybe see how we can gain more converts and make the liturgy more accessible, it was also a nod to the early church. And
Yeah.
it wasn't to the extent that this was antiquarianism, as some suppose. Because, for example, they say, oh, you'll never know that it's a sacrifice, only a meal. The first mass I ever attended was the Novus Ordo, and I was not unaware in the least that this was a sacrifice. Just listen to the Eucharistic prayer.
Right. Jungmann. He is a controversial figure among the ultra traditionalists.
Mm,
Among the ultra traditionalists, Jungmann is the great boogeyman. And,
mm,
and and he is the guy that is most excoriated by them for creating what they consider to be a kind of false primitivism with
mm,
regard to our approach to liturgy. Namely, if I can show you by detailing the history of the Roman Rite that in 250 AD in Rome or Florence or whatever, the Mass was radically simpler, facing the people in the vernacular and so on. Therefore, that legitimates the Novus Ordo. And the ultra traditionalists are going to say this is primitivism
mhm.
because the fact is the liturgy evolved. It did develop into what we now know as the sort of traditional Latin Mass. And that evolution had good reasons behind it
Yeah,
and happened also relatively early, ninth century, 8th century, whatever, where it sort of gets standardized. And therefore Jungmann is and those who follow him are guilty of a certain primitivism that
primitivism. Yeah,
that disavows the organic development of the liturgy. I know scholars like Peter Kwasniewski. I don't know if you're familiar with Peter.
Yeah, yeah.
I have strong disagreements with Peter Kwasniewski, big time.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, he's a pretty good scholar with regard to liturgy. And even though the conclusions he draws are bad ones, that only the Latin Mass is valid. He thinks the Novus Ordo is just almost demonic. And I don't agree with any of that. But this is his accusation with regard to Jungmann. And I think when I was in seminary, we read Jungmann and his history of the liturgy, and so I also too was very smitten and taken with his analysis. But maybe we're having our first point of disagreement here. I think that some of Jungmann's analysis of the early liturgy is suspect historically speaking, and that some liturgical scholarship today would point to the fact that some of the things that he highlighted were not necessarily as historically certain as he claims that they were. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I like Jungmann. I think that he has to be listened to. But in other words, I'm going to agree with the traditionalists in one sense.
Okay.
What happened in Rome in 200 AD isn't necessarily what we should be doing now.
Today. Yeah, I know. I agree with that. I do agree with that. Yep.
And so if we want to simply use that kind of historical analysis in order to delegitimate the Tridentine liturgy, in some sense, I have a certain issue with that. I will agree. This only goes to show you, I'm not agenda driven. I'm willing to acknowledge where the traditionalists are maybe
exactly
right about something. That we can't engage in this kind of primitivism. Anyway, so I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I'm just throwing that out there as maybe a different perspective.
Qualifier.
On Jungmann. Yeah, that's a better word, a qualifier.
And you know what, Larry? I agree with you 100%. The reason I brought that up was not to say, because the early church did it, we should go back to that practice wholesale. I wasn't making that kind of a judgment. I was just highlighting those elements to say the Novus Ordo isn't entirely foreign in the history of the church.
Right. Oh, that's true.
That's all I'm saying.
And I should make that clear. I agree with you 100% with regard. That's why I'm saying I'm not really disagreeing with you. As maybe adding a qualifier, a complementary sort of analysis, because the fact is, where I do disagree with some of these ultra traditionalists is this notion that once the liturgy did evolve into the traditional Latin Mass, say, that we get to see after the Council of Trent, once it did evolve into that somehow it's set in stone. Right. It can't be changed. That popes have no right to change it. That it's some sort of, that it almost, the image that one gets is this is the divine liturgy in the sense that it really came to us directly from God somehow.
Kind of like Protestants view the Bible, some of them.
Yeah, exactly. It came down on the wings of some kind of angel or something. The fact is, it is the divine liturgy, but it's the divine liturgy precisely because the Holy Spirit, through the medium of the church and her authority, gave us this liturgy.
Amen.
As rooted in the revelation of Christ.
Yes.
But the church has every right to change it.
Yes.
And the traditionalists love to cite that statement from Pius V that anybody who changes this liturgy, let them die of leeches or something or other. This is patent absurdity. The fact is, popes, the church has changed. So that is the point Jungmann makes, and you are making, that is absolutely true. That this notion that the liturgy is frozen post-Trent into this form and this form only, in some sense, that's a heresy.
It is.
I think that's a heresy.
Yeah. So, and
I don't know what heresy, but I'm going to say that.
It's probably, we have a long list of them, so it's probably falls under one of them. But
I'll claim that.
Yeah. So I would say that there are certain developments in the liturgy that happen for a reason. So, for example, I would say that in today's climate, where so few Catholics believe in the real presence, I believe that communion on the tongue and kneeling is actually preferential because we have a defect. We don't see the sacred. So this will help orient our
Right.
bodies and our minds to that
Right.
reality. So I agree. Just because something was done doesn't mean we need to go back to it. We need to look at what fits our context today and what could remedy some of our problems. So I agree with you 1,000%. And that's why when I was before COVID, I would always receive kneeling and on the tongue, even when there was no altar rail. Some people probably thought I was nuts, but that was just where I was at spiritually. But now that I have read more history of the liturgy, do I have an inherent problem with receiving on the hand? For example, if I'm going up in a line of communion and there's an EMC and not the priest, will I not receive on the hand? No, I will, but I'll be very careful that there are no particles. And so on. So
I do the same thing. I do the same thing.
Amen.
I'll take it on the hand if I'm being given it by a lay person.
Yes, exactly my point. So you brought up quo primum, and a lot of people use that to say nobody has the authority to restrict, much less abolish the Latin Mass. So whether we agree with or like Pope Francis's motu proprio, just sheer fact-based, does the Pope have the authority to do this with the liturgy?
Well, of course he does. I mean, the Pope has universal jurisdictional authority over the church, which, by the way, brings up an interesting point with regard to some of these traditionalists. They are now attacking Vatican I.
Right.
And Vatican I's sort of definition of papal power, not just infallibility, but of the universal jurisdictional authority of the Pope. And so I've read numerous things in social media from the ultra-traditionalists saying, well, we really have to take another look at Vatican I. But this is what I'm talking about with peeling back the layers of the onion. Because the church, the modern church, isn't squaring up with your ideological orientations with regard to what the church should be, you're trying to find a place of some kind of rupture. And so now you're going all the way back now to Vatican I and saying, oh, you know what, that gave the Pope too much power. And it all boils down to this. You don't like Pope Francis. If they had a Pope, this is it's human nature, right?
Sure.
When liberals, when John Paul was Pope, liberals hated him. And so the liberals were, to heck with papal authority. It's exaggerated. We have a right to dissent. But now that Pope Francis is Pope and the liberals think he's a liberal, they're wrong about that, but the liberals think he's a liberal. It's like the liberals have become the ultramontanists. You have to pay attention to Pope Francis. You have to do what he says.
So ironic.
And all of the conservative Catholics who said, you have to listen to Paul VI and John Paul II and are now like, well, you don't have to listen to the Pope. Who the heck listens to the Pope? It all boils, and this only goes to show human nature and sinfulness. And the fact is, a Catholic listens to the Pope.
That's it.
Okay, that's it. And the spirit of dissent and the spirit of Protestant dissension is precisely this notion that I'll only obey the Pope if it's a Pope that I like.
Yes, sir. Now,
and that goes with the liturgy as well.
Sure,
okay?
Sure.
The Pope obviously has the right to change the liturgy. But if he changes it in a way that I don't like, then to heck with that Pope,
Is that what Pastor Aeternus says? I don't think so. In fact, Pastor Aeternus condemns with anathema attached those who think that the Roman Pontiff doesn't have universal jurisdiction, not just over teachings of faith and morals, but the discipline and governance of the church. Does liturgy fall under that juncture? Yeah, it does.
It sure does. But that's why they have to paint the liturgy as something that comes down on the wings of angels.
I see.
Because if it comes directly to us from God, you were totally right in your analogy with Protestants who believe the Bible came right down on the fundamentalist Protestants who the Bible came down on the wings of an angel. Okay, so that there's something that sort of supersedes the authority even of a pope, and that's liturgy, because the liturgy came directly, ipsissima verba Dei. It's right from the mouth of God, which is wrong.
Right. I mean,
that's not true.
If vernacular, if versus populum, if communion on the hand were inherently evil, then the first Mass was a sacrilege. The Last Supper. It was versus
Christ.
populum.
I mean,
Yeah.
Christ says, "Take this," and the New Testament doesn't say whether he put it on their tongues or handed it to. But if they were following the standard sort of Jewish Passover meal format, they would have each grabbed a piece of the Eucharistic bread themselves.
Yeah, he who put his hand and dipped in the dish with me.
Yeah.
Right.
Now
So-
that wasn't necessarily though the Eucharist, where
Right.
Judas, that was part of sort of the
The
Seder.
Seder. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but still, you're absolutely correct. The context was Seder meal Passover, and if that's true, then they were not when Jesus distributed communion. They weren't kneeling, and he didn't put it on their tongue with intinction or whatever.
And he wasn't speaking Latin either.
No, he was almost certainly speaking Aramaic.
Yes. Yes. So Pope Francis has the authority to do this. And by the way, if you read, not you personally, but if viewers out there read Mediator Dei, it's very clear that the Pope has authority over the liturgy. Now, the Novus Ordo doesn't change anything substantially in the way of faith and morals, or even what the substance of the liturgy is. It's the sacrifice of Christ represented, made present. There are certain accidental features that change. Now, interestingly enough, Pope Gregory the Great, he did something rather unilateral himself, because he went to the Greek East. When he came back, he started incorporating things into the Roman Rite that were characteristics of Byzantium, and he did this unilaterally. But and some people actually resisted. So there's a bit of an analogy of what happened in today's climate. Now, we could say the reasons for the pushback in today's climate are more justified. And look, I just want to put this on the carpet, full disclosure. I think the Pope did this for a very real reason. And the reason we're having this discussion in this podcast is because there is a real danger associated with radical reactionary traditionalism, and those who would use the beautiful TLM as a veneer to hide their true motives. Once their toy is taken away, we see what the substance of their faith is. But let me be clear, there are very many TLM Catholics who are just as obedient to the living magisterium, who accept Vatican II.
Yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. And I know lots of them.
And that's the collateral damage here. Those are the people that I feel most sorry for, because they didn't do anything to deserve this rather heavy-handed approach.
Yes, I know tons, because I'm a traditionalist of a certain sort, and I'm sympathetic with many traditionalists. And most traditionalists that I know who attend the traditional Latin Mass are fully devoted to the papacy, to the church, to her authority. And that's why, though, they were deeply wounded by the motu proprio, which I think was not really pastorally sensitive to what it is that these Catholics are seeking as they, and it goes back to what I said about the most important thing is the faith element that animates the community of a liturgy. I think one of the things that gets ignored is that one of the things that people are attracted to about the traditional Latin Mass isn't so much the Mass itself, but the community that surrounds itself around that Mass. So if you're a parent with like 4, 5, 6, 7 children, as many of them have, you're seeking a community of believers that can help you raise your children in the faith. That's and right. These are intentional communities of people who truly believe. And my heart breaks for them because of the motu proprio. I think that these communities should have been encouraged and not slapped down.
Yes.
And if there are ideological aberrations that have crept in because of certain internet torquemadas, then they should have been dealt with.
I agree.
But I feel nothing but compassion for most people who attend traditional Latin Masses, because I think they are extremely devout Catholics who should be empowered.
Yes, I agree. And I want to give a special mention to my friends Danny Daher and James Murphy. And I bring their names up because they are two Catholics that I know. One of them serves at the TLM. One is a regular attendee. Both of these guys. One of them, James Murphy, was on my show clearing up misconceptions about Vatican II, and yet he loves the Latin Mass. He serves at it. So these people are out there. Don't be discouraged and misled by the vitriol that you see and read online or hear or watch. I mean, just look at the response of the FSSP, right? We had one YouTube commentator saying that they're too papist.
Well, exactly. You know, I went to seminary with Father Jim Jackson, who is an FSSP priest, who in fact sort of ran the FSSP for a while. Mm-hmm. And a more stellar example of holy obedience to the Pope you could not find.
Yes.
And the idea that he is therefore a sellout to the papacy, that certain internet provocateurs are saying, is absolutely outrageous. What he is a Catholic.
And you know what? We're all traditionalists, because is there anything more traditional than being obedient to the living magisterium of Jesus Christ Church? Is there anything more traditional? No. You have to be.
Yeah. And by definition, a Catholic is a traditionalist. By
Amen.
definition.
And
which is why progressive liberal Catholics are barely Catholic. That's, you know, and I'll say that we've been criticizing traditionalists. But the fact of the matter is, they are a reaction against
some other problem.
A deeper issue within the church, a deeper wound within the church, which is the ongoing hegemony of control that sort of progressive and liberal Catholics have in vast swaths of sort of the American church, still to this day. And they are not traditionalists. In fact, they repudiate tradition. You know, so, and if I have any chief complaint against Pope Francis, it is that he has re-empowered that wing of the church.
Yes, I agree.
And that is how so many of my friends, like the moral theologian Janet Smith, who is a wonderful, wonderful person, but who is very anti-Pope Francis. But she is anti-Pope Francis because of his Episcopal appointments,
right?
Who it is that he has re-empowered. And, you know, when you see people like Cardinal Supich, James Martin, Cardinal Tobin, these sorts of people. But then again, in defense of Pope Francis, it's not as if all of the Episcopal appointments of Pope John Paul were all that stellar either. Right. You know, like Bernardine in Chicago was a John Paul appointment. You know, Bergoglio was a John Paul appointment. So, you know, the fact is, popes sometimes appoint people that you don't want appointed, but you don't know often why that happens.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that we don't know, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
And the Pope has advisors. Maybe the advisors give him the wrong information. Maybe they're the ones with the agenda.
Well,
who knows?
You know, yeah. I mean, how many dioceses are there in the world? The idea that the Pope can sort of keep tabs on, he's like in the Vatican pulling all these levers. He's got like 10 banks of TV screens and computer screens in front of her. He's like, you know, he's on his keyboard figuring out who's going to be the Bishop of Kathmandu. You know, right. I just don't think that's the way it works.
I agree.
You know?
And we got a question here from Chris. He says, does Dr. Chapp thinks that Vatican II and the NO have exacerbated the divide with our Orthodox brethren?
That's an interesting question. Vatican II, no. But the Novus Ordo, perhaps, yes.
Perhaps, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, I'm friends with a lot of Orthodox and as well as sort of Catholic, Eastern Catholics.
Yeah.
And one of the things, a lot of them are my friends. And one of the things that they confide in me is that they are very disturbed by the liturgical reforms of the Catholic Church. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean they're right. I mean, I don't know about you, Justin, but I've attended my fair share, of like Eastern Catholic liturgies. Mm-hmm. And precisely because I, was the victim of certain Novus Ordo parishes with, 800 Eucharistic ministers and liturgical dancing and,
Mm-hmm.
a cactus in the holy water font during Lent. and so you think, oh, dear God in heaven, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And so I'm going to go to this Eastern Catholic liturgy. But I have to say, every single time I've gone to an Eastern Catholic liturgy, I was left cold.
Oh, okay.
They're beautiful. Bells, incense, chanting, holy things to the holy, and all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
But they're endlessly repetitious. And the fact is, I think they could use with some streamlining and reform themselves. So the thing is, okay, the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholics are critical of the Novus Ordo, many of them. And perhaps rightly so. I'm critical of the Novus Ordo. I'm not opposed to it. It's valid. It can be done beautifully, but I think it needs a serious upgrade. So I'm sympathetic with their critique.
Yeah.
But you know what? Their own liturgies could use some reforming. Quite frankly, in other words, I'll maybe admit my modernistic proclivities. I don't like sitting through a 2-hour liturgy of endless repetition.
Right. And I mean, no, and let's get it clear. No mass, no liturgy gives more grace than the other. What might change is depending on one's taste, they might be more disposed or less disposed, but objectively speaking, the same grace is available at all masses. Same with me. When I went to an Orthodox liturgy for a while, when I was discerning Orthodoxy, it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I love the incense. I'm always
beautiful.
The first guy in the front row inhaling all the incense because I don't get enough of it at the Novus Ordo.
And their incense is great.
It sure is. It sure is. But I remember after coffee hour, and I so badly wanted to be Orthodox. And, people would ask me, oh, so what do you think about the Great Schism when the Catholics left us in 1054? And I was really wanting to be Orthodox. But even I would say to them, well, that's not that simple. I mean, that's one date. It's a mutual excommunication. There was intercommunion up to the sack of Constantinople and even beyond in the Middle East. So I found myself even disagreeing with them when I wanted to be among them. And I got to the point where I said, look, I can't justify breaking communion. I just can't. Beautiful liturgy or not.
It is a beautiful liturgy. But the fact is, we have to realize, to go back to the question from your viewer, which is a great question, by the way, because I wish we could have intercommunion with the Orthodox. I really do. I think Rome wants intercommunion with the Orthodox more than the Orthodox want intercommunion with us.
We allow it in our canon law, right?
Yeah. But I too love the Orthodox liturgy. It's gorgeous and all that. But we have to realize that there is an anti-Roman, anti-Catholic animus.
Oh, of course.
That motivates a lot of Orthodox thinkers. One of the greatest barriers to intercommunion between the Orthodox and the Catholics is that the theologians up here might agree on certain formulations.
Right.
But in the pews, especially among the Orthodox, they have been fed centuries and centuries and centuries of anti-Catholic polemic,
right?
That mitigates against any kind of Irenic sort of coming together of the two communions, and until the Orthodox stop that nonsense, intercommunion is not going to be possible. They have got to set aside their. The thing is about the Orthodox is they're like the Irish with grudges. Okay, they just never forget anything. So 1054, and then the sack of Constantinople, get over it. Okay,
We've apologized for that.
We've apologized. We've moved on. Things have changed in the past 500, 600 years, for crying out loud, and the pressing needs of the modern world, where everything has gone secular, everything is now post-Christian. We need to reunify. We need to come together. And yet there's this constant, still drip, 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 drip. Oh, Immaculate Conception, blah, blah, blah. Now, you know what? Stop it. Just stop it. There is nothing communion dividing in our doctrines.
No, there isn't.
There isn't. And there is only an emotional, historically rooted animus against the Roman Church that is precluding our coming back together. And to come back to your viewer's question, I think that any criticism of the Novus Ordo that comes from the Orthodox is in many ways simply part and parcel of this animus against Rome, because the Orthodox have no issue whatsoever with engaging very amicably, for example, the World Council of Churches,
Right.
Protestant denominations, Lutherans, and so on. Well, their liturgy isn't exactly up to snuff either with regard to Orthodox standards, but
Right.
they're willing, on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, to sort of bend over backwards, especially with regard to the Lutherans, and say, well, let's maybe think about even intercommunion. There was discussion
Right.
like 10 years ago about the Orthodox Church having intercommunion with Lutherans, which never came to fruition, of course, because it couldn't. But this is what I'm talking about. There's a lot of baggage there with regard to the Orthodox. The Orthodox aren't perfect. And any Catholic that says, because of Pope Francis, I'm wistfully looking at the East.
Grass isn't greener.
You need to read the history of the Eastern churches. There isn't a dadgum dictator that they didn't love.
Yep.
So long as that dictator gave the Orthodox Church all kinds of privileges. There's a lot of skeletons in the Orthodox closet that needs to be brought out into the open, that the Orthodox don't want to talk about, but they need to talk about. And I'm on a rant now, but I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, all the Christological heresies during the first 7 ecumenical councils, guess where they began?
East.
They all began in the East. Iconoclasm, you name it. And the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, that is based on the Eastern idea of the pre-purified virgin. So there's no difference.
Is.
You don't like the word purgatory? Fine, don't use it. Not a big deal. It's just a word.
But they believe in it. It's just a different idea. And they believe in Mary's sinlessness. It's just a different concept of her sinlessness.
That's right. It's the same theology. I mean,
but it's not communion. It shouldn't be communion breaking.
No, it's not. I mean, the whole idea of there were whole slews of Russian Orthodox that even had orders fashioned after the Immaculate Conception and devotions to the 5 wounds of Christ. Saint Dmitry Rostov prayed the rosary, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, the Russian Soloviev pointed this out constantly, and pointed out too. Soloviev, pointed out that, look, as you said, most of the heresies came from the East, and if it wasn't for Rome, we'd all be monophysites.
Yeah, exactly. So, so don't get this idea that because there's problems in the Roman Church, you go east and you'll be free of problems. I guarantee you 100% that won't be the case, and you'll be sorely disappointed. And, at the end of the day, if I could just kind of have a word, this pontificate, it shows Catholics where their faith is at. Are we Catholics because of a pope we do or don't like? Or are we Catholic because of Jesus Christ and him alone? I'm Catholic because of the latter.
Exactly. And that Christ promised to Peter that he was the rock upon which he was going to build the church. Yeah. You either believe in the fact that Peter has the keys, or you don't, because of Christ. Because of Christ.
Because of Christ.
Not because of some sort of Gibbon's idea that the Catholic Church is just the Roman Empire in a different iteration.
No.
So many traditionalists are now buying into that same stupid narrative.
Yep.
To be a Catholic means to accept the fact that Peter is the rock of the church.
Yes.
That doesn't mean Peter doesn't make mistakes.
Of course.
Because he has. But it ultimately means you owe a filial obedience to the Pope.
Yes. And let's be clear that this idea of the primacy of the Roman pontiff, or the supremacy of him, is not due to the Roman Empire. It is due to the biblical faith. Because in
Yeah.
Isaiah 22, we see a picture of the royal steward of the king of Judah, who was also a Melchizedek high priest. And when this king of Judah was physically absent, he gave his royal steward, the royal vizier, literally, not figuratively only, but literally the keys to the temple, and he slept with them under his head on the foundation stone, and he had charge over the sacred vessels of the temple worship. So this is thoroughly Jewish, it's thoroughly biblical, it's not Greco-Roman.
Exactly. And if Peter, instead of having gone to Rome to lead the Church of Rome and been martyred in Rome, if he had remained, say, in Antioch,
That would be the mother church.
and said, and died in Antioch, a martyr, then that would be the mother church
Yep. Ethiopia, same thing.
of the Catholic faith. Exactly.
Yep. It's where he spilled his blood, not where he passed through, but where he died. That's why Rome has the primacy. And if you read the fathers, East and West, they never ascribe primacy based off of imperial power or standing. Never.
No, never. It has nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing to do with it.
So look, if we tell Protestants and Orthodox, become Catholic, obedience to the Pope is necessary, but then we spend all our time bashing and trashing the Pope and calling it the whore of Babylon and the beast, do we look schizophrenic? Does that look like something that we would want they should be a part of if we don't even believe it ourselves, the thing that we're teaching them? I don't think that's a very good look for us.
It's not. And the I don't know what to call them, ultra traditionalists or whatever. What's the Tradicals? A friend of mine calls them the Tradicals. God bless them. We've kind of trashed them here tonight, but who we're trashing are the people that are making money off of this.
Yeah,
The clickbait provocateurs on the internet.
people are genuinely wounded.
But there are millions of Catholics, exactly. You're absolutely right, Justin. They are wounded and they're looking for something. And I have nothing but absolute sympathy and compassion and solidarity with those Catholics.
Would there be radical reactionary traditionalists if there wasn't something to react against that was an infection? No.
Well, yeah. I mean, the past 50, 60 years of the church would give anybody heartburn.
Yes. Let me just do one more question, then I'm gonna close with something. Okay.
Okay.
Does Dr. Chapp have an opinion on the recent trend among traditionalists defending integralism? Now, this I'm not familiar with, so you'll have to enlighten me as well.
Oh gosh, we're towards the tail end of our conversation here, and that is simply an enormously complex question. I'll simply say this: all governments are ultimately integralists. All governments are ultimately confessional states, insofar as they all adhere to a core set of dogmas and beliefs and worldviews and ideologies that animate the culture. And the United States is no exception. Okay, we have certain political dogmas that govern the way that we do things. There's no such thing as a value-neutral government. There's no such thing as a morally neutral government. All politics is ultimately theological.
Right.
So the only question that is truly left is the quality of the theology that animates your government. Okay,
Right.
so Vatican II and Nostra Aetate, and no, not Nostra Aetate, Dignitatis Humanae, articulated a vision of religious freedom, wherein the council prescinded from any question of integralism or confessional states. Said, well, we're not even going to talk about that. And simply said this: whatever form of government we have, whether it's a confessional state or a non-confessional state, we need to acknowledge the fundamental principle of religious freedom, because a coerced faith is no faith.
Yes.
And faith is oriented to truth, and truth can only be embraced in freedom. And therefore, religious freedom is a constitutive principle of Christology and human nature that the church needs to pay more attention to. This is something that Archbishop Lefebvre dissented from. It is. A lot of people think that the main point of the Lefebvrean dissent was liturgy. It wasn't. It was this point about religious liberty. It really
Really?
was. Yes.
Oh, okay.
John Paul II, for example, was perfectly willing to grant Lefebvrites to do the Latin Mass
Sure.
on the proviso that they accepted the Second Vatican Council. But the Lefebvrites refused to accept the Second Vatican Council. And it was primarily this issue of religious freedom that they objected to.
It wasn't Nostra Aetate because Lefebvre
No,
signed all documents, right?
It was Dignitatis Humanae's statement that freedom, religious freedom is oriented to truth. All religious faith is oriented to truth, and truth has to be embraced in freedom. And therefore, any notion of the coercive power of the state has to be nuanced. Even if you have a confessional state, even if you have an officially Catholic government, monarch, whatever form of government you have, there has to be religious freedom, because it is inherently contrary to the gospel to force people to believe, or more pertinently, to coerce people to believe through various carrot and stick approaches.
Yeah.
So this was the contentious part of the Vatican Council that the Lefebvrites rejected. And it is the contentious part that so many modern traditionalists also reject. And this is where I most strenuously dissent from the modern traditionalists.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know it was like that. I thought it was over different under different auspices, but that's really interesting.
No, that's it. It's religious freedom. Religious freedom is the issue, which is why the Assisi thing from John Paul is so important to them. Because in their mind, this is simply the cherry on the cake of Vatican II's embracing of religious freedom.
I see.
And this is what this is what I find most troubling about traditionalists. Essentially, when you unpack what they're saying, is that they're in favor of the government coercing people to become Catholics.
Yeah. Oh man, this is really enlightening. Thank you, Larry, for sharing that. I had no idea. I just want to give a special shout out to Steak Bake, who's been watching. He said, "Thanks, guys, for sacrificing your time to share your insight and knowledge. I'm young and don't know so much, so I appreciate it. Always helpful." Well, thank you. And Steak Bake, if you would be so kind as to subscribe and maybe share this video amongst your family and friends, and get people to watch. Because I think what we said here tonight, like I say, we're not attacking the people. It's just about certain ideas that are dangerous. And let me be clear, liberalism is just as poisonous. So we're not just picking on one side. Yeah. We happen to be talking about it because it's the topic of our conversation. But
we could do a whole show trashing Catholic liberals that would make our criticism of traditionalists look pallid by comparison. Yeah, exactly.
We'd have to do like a 100-part series on liberalism. But guys, what I wanted to leave y'all with is this. Okay, now people say, you know, when we say, well, Vatican II hasn't been implemented properly, people are getting tired of hearing that, and they kind of scoff at it. Well, look, this is why knowing church history is so important. Okay, so let's say that Vatican II hasn't been implemented properly within the last 50 years. Okay, 50 years. Remember that number. Let's hold every ecumenical of the council of the Catholic Church to that same standard. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? None, not one of the first 7 ecumenical councils were quote unquote implemented properly within, forget 50 years. How many hundreds of years did Arianism proceed after Nicaea?
Just ask Athanasius whether he thought Nicaea was received properly.
Right. So if Vatican II
and then Maximus the Confessor, what didn't he have his tongue cut out or something?
He did, and he was loyal to Rome.
Yeah.
So if Vatican II is a failure because it hasn't been implemented in the last 50 years properly, then every single ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, including the first 7, which Orthodox and Catholics hold in common, they're all failures, and this thing is a sham. So let's be consistent.
Absolutely.
All right? So guys, I just want to thank you. I want to send my love and pray for God's blessings upon you, your family, and friends. Thank you for taking your time tonight to spend it with us and watch us and listen to us rant. I greatly appreciated spending time with you, Larry. It was wonderful. And I just want to close the show by saying that you've been watching Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 49. with Dr. Larry Chapp. And the next episode I have will be with Dr. Steve Weidenkopf. And it's interesting because that episode will be on the times that the Catholic Church has been in crisis and prevailed. So very timely, given our discussion
Did he write
today.
a book about that?
He did, which he graciously sent
I
me.
have that book, and I'm going to read it now.
Yes, I have to read it between now and October 6th. So, yeah, definitely going to do that and have him on. And October is the month of the Holy Rosary. So please pray for us. And we ask the Blessed Mother's grace and her prayers. And God bless you guys. And we'll talk to you again soon. Have a great evening. And I'll end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.